Hello everyone, welcome to What If Ichigo Was in High School DXD Part 5, Chapter 13. Under the Sun. The outright horror in his voice, the petrified, stricken gaze of the maid and the dark wooden walls towering accusingly over her, made for a terrific pressure she really didn't need. Flinching away from his pleading gaze, her eyes wildly searched the planks of the floors, hoping for some secretly hidden directions in their wooden pattern. Any word she could muster crumbled to ashes in her mouth, and those same ashes seemed to pour down her throat, filling her breath with a dry and gritty friction. What on earth was she to say? Did she love him? A hysterical laugh rang mockingly in her mind. Isaka herself wasn't quite sure as to what she felt towards him. The letter crunched in his hand was more of a way to gather her thoughts than an actual full-blown confession. She felt something. Obviously. However, she wasn't foolish or naive enough to believe that it was pure love. Attraction. Most definitely. Affection was also a certainty. Through both merriment and crisis, she had connected with Ichigo on an intellectual and, somewhat, sentimental level. There was unquestionably something there that went beyond the mundane, but as to what it actually was. Though, to be honest, at this very moment she was feeling the not-so-subtle sensation of wanting to flee from those wavering brown eyes. Her own conflicted gaze lifted from the floor and slowly tracked up his body. There was a terrifying stillness to his chest that heavily opposed to the male definitiveness of his throat, which visibly quivered in emotion. Akasama. Ani-san. The unbearable stillness of the air was terrifically shattered by the nervous call of Kunu. The little girl's hand was held to trembling lips, as even her immature mind was able to discern the obvious tension that built up between Yusaka and her husband. Said husband completely aware of the fact now. Finally remembering to take a breath, Yusaka quickly wiped away the wetness on her cheeks with her sleeve and sent a shaky smile towards her daughter. "Sweetie, why don't you return to your room? Mommy has something she needs to discuss with your Ani-san." But as Kunu's gaze nervously flickered between her and Ichigo, Yusaka looked towards the maid doing her best to blend in with the background. "Take Kunu back to her room." The command was accompanied by a steely look that effectively decreed a gag order on the events that had just occurred. If anything spread amongst the servants, Yusaka would know exactly who to punish. The servant girl said no words and merely acknowledged the directive with a shaky nod. She quickly took Kunu's hand and began to pull her daughter away. Kunu Haim," she said in a hushed whisper. The poor young girl kept sending heavily upset looks at her mother and Ichigo as the maid dragged her away. Yusaka watched the quickly fading figure of her daughter with an ever-growing tear in her heart. The obvious distress shadowing her daughter's usually shimmering eyes filled her with another form of discomfort. She had been dreading the very possible break of her and Ichigo's friendship. However, she had entirely failed to realize just how devastated Kunu would be if Ichigo ceased associating with them. The little girl had become incredibly fond of the young devil. And with a laborious eye, Ichigo usurped her attention as the center of her surroundings. He had taken a single step back, shoulder blades to the wall, and she flinched heavily when her ears filled with the sound of the back of his skull banging solidly against the wood surface. His eyes were fixed to the ceiling in a dead stare. "You bitch." Her fingers curled painfully into a fist and her nails pierced the flesh of her palm. She wasn't quite sure as to whom he was referring to. Was it the interfering queen in the heavens or was it her? She averted her gaze away from him and pinned them to the floor just a few paces away from his feet. Though, she caught every movement of his from the corner of her vision. A moment passed and he slowly slid down, seating himself against the wall with his head hung down, his face shadowed by sharp strands of hair. Her throat constricted nervously and, with a tentative and shaken resolve, she took a single step forward. "Ichigo." However, Yusaka quickly cut herself off as she felt a warmth grip her hand. With a quiet surprise, she noted his outstretched arm and trailed her eyes along the fabric of his shirt to find his hand claiming hers. She blinked once in a confused pause before letting out a startled cry. "Ah." The winds flashed across her face as both knees hit the hard floor and, the next thing she knew, she was being pressed from the back of her neck to his chest. It took a few seconds for her to register what had just happened, but as his breath spread hotness through the fur of her ears, her face responded with a deep flush when she did. Several more seconds passed as the temperature in her cheeks continued to climb. "Ichigo." And again, his touch deftly silenced her. His other arm came around her waist and pressed a profound heat through the silk of her clothes and onto her skin. Yusaka shivered in a delight that felt all too wrong and willingly melded deeper into the highly uncomfortably position. Her fingers fisted and clenched at the fabric of his shirt, she nearly died with embarrassment as she barely managed to hold a moan of pleasure as he massaged the back of her neck and rubbed his chin over the crown of her head. She had to bite her lower lip hard in order to contain the cry of desire. "Yusaka." She shuddered at how flat his tone was. How entirely casual and opposite to his embrace it sounded. "I think I'm going insane." The smooth delivery of the line nearly caused her to scoff out loud. "You're going insane? How do you think I feel?" So, he finally said after a very pregnant pause and with an almost insulting casualness that implied the involved interest of discussing the weather. Married, huh? She tried to wriggle out of his arms, but he kept her caged in an ironclad hold. Apparently. She responded cautiously. Despite the completely inappropriate level of concern in the inflection of their speech, or to be more specific the utter lack of, Yusaka still found her pulse throbbing quite wildly. Which really irked her considering she could feel his demonic one beat with a steady and regular rhythm. Out of curiosity. Yusaka's mood shifted further and further away from anxiety and more towards frustration with every word of his spoken. What the hell was wrong with him? How can possibly sound as if he's totally disinterested in the fact he was tricked into being married? It was as if he wasn't involved at all in the whole sordid affair. At what point do we exactly have to along with any of this? She could hear the letter clenched in his hand crinkle from behind her. Traditionally speaking, marriage has always been more of a spiritual thing than that of a legal one. She picked her words with a cautious low. In our case, it's a form of a bond that signifies a promise to one another through mutual commitment. Mutual commitment. Though spoken quietly, his words held no little incredulity. There are. And her words held just the slightest tinge of bitterness to them. Ways to circumvent the finer details with the proper methods. I'm sure, he said sardonically. Why can't I feel this bond of ours? Her face became unbearably hot. It only finalizes once the marriage has been consummated. A short pause passed before he said, oh so the entirety of the letter is true? Yes, oh you understating jerk. Her nose pressed to the bone of his collar, Yusaka inhaled his smoky scent with a mute sigh. For the most part. I see in that bit about you loving me. She didn't stiffen so much as she jolted in his arms. Wonderful. She had temporarily forgotten about that little tidbit of the letter towards the end. The one which had caused this entire scenario to play out in the first place. Unfortunately, it seemed to have remained at the forefront of his mind. Ichigo. She began hesitantly. I don't actually love you. There was no reaction from him. Neither verbally nor physically. That isn't to say I dislike you. She added quickly and pulled her head up to meet his gaze before dropping it down timidly. Her eyes wildly danced as she struggled to find the right phrasing. I do like you not in that way, though. Okay, maybe in that way. Wait, no. I don't mean I like you, it's just that. She trailed off as his chest began to rumble. Oh heavens, was he crying? He couldn't possibly be crying. Surely not him. Yusaka tore her eyes from his chest to his face. And the moment she did, her mien froze. You're laughing. She stated in quiet bafflement as he bit his lips. Suddenly, her brows furrowed and frustration bubbled in her lungs. Why are you laughing? Stop it. She was practically having a mental breakdown and here he was, laughing at her. The nerve of this boy. His chuckles grew in volume until he finally threw his back and began to jovially gush in full laughter. Stop it. She yelled indignantly as she smacked his chest. Hey, Yusaka, he said through his fit of misplaced madness and past her vexation. Rolling his head around and brushing messy bangs away, he looked at her and curved a roguish grin. I like you. She was positive her usually pale skin was glowing crimson as her breath caught in her throat. Her response was the ever-eloquent, huh? I like you, but I don't think I love you. Mischief dappling in his eyes, he gave her a tilted look. But I think I might start to. Though her eyes widened and she honestly, cliched as it sounded, felt her heart skip a beat. How was she supposed to respond to this again? I like you too. Yusaka wanted to hide her face in her hands. Their conversation was so sophomoric. It sounded like something out of a poorly written teenage story. Hey. Why yes. And the fact that she was following along with these stupid and juvenile lines made her feel all the more mortified. You're such a spoiled princess. And immediately awkwardness gave way to roiling rage. I am not SPMMMFFF. Ichigo was pissed. Generally speaking, he really couldn't care less what other people got up to. But he absolutely loathed it when people decided to get into his business. Granted, he was pretty understanding in certain regards. Fully taking into consideration the other's party's views and motivations, he never truly cast judgment on a first impression. Except for Urahara. The man was a creepy asshole no matter how you looked at him. It was a unanimous agreement from anyone and everyone who had ever met him. Except from Orihime. But that had more to do with the fact that the woefully naive girl didn't have a mean bone in her body and less to do with any redeeming qualities on part the former Shinigami captain. Still, as far as Urahara was concerned, his century-long machinations went widely ignored by Ichigo because, despite his eccentricities, the man was inherently good. Urahara had never acted out of malice and had always done his best to help Ichigo out whenever he needed it. There was also Surzuchi's. His newfound friend and employer was quite blatant about his manipulations. Not so much in their execution, but more in the admitting of their existence. And, as far as Ichigo was concerned, he could live with that. First of all, had no illusions as to what kind of person Surzuchi's was. The man was Lucifer. The single most reviled name in human history, and damn it all if Cerziches hadn't earned his way to the crown by slaughtering through entire armies of foe and family. Nevertheless, Cerziches was still a relatively good person, regardless of his own claim to the otherwise. Rafie and Milikas were all the evidence he needed on that front. Amaterasu, the metaphorical matriarch of his homeland. His self-proclaimed mother. An assertion which, in regards to whatever remained of his humanity, rang true. And she had betrayed him. In the most personal way possible, she had violated that modicum of trust that had been wrenched from his demonic heart upon meeting her. Was his out of spite and malevolence? Highly doubtful. It simply went against her nature to do something like that. Ichigo was 100% positive that Amaterasu actually loved him like her own child. And he knew all too well that sometimes love causes a person to do incredibly foolish things. Which was why he wasn't holding a monstrous grudge towards the embodiment of the sun. Oh, he was royally pissed, don't get him wrong. And as soon as the opportunity presented itself he was going to let her know. But that left one major problem. The problem, which was the entire reason he had arrived in Kyoto in the first place. Yusaka. Breathtakingly beautiful Yusaka. The somewhat awkward friendship with the single mother, who was so much more, had taken a fantastic dive off a cliff. The whole fiasco was made all the more entertaining and ironic when the realization was made that she was caught between the problems of mother and son. Married on a divine whim, the wife was already suffering due to the schemes of her husband's mother. Wife. He never thought that a single word could be so utterly terrifying. She was his wife. The woman he was fully intent on asking out on a date turned out to be his wife, and all on a fucking technicality at that too. His consent to the marriage was heavily questionable under the circumstances. Yusaka was his wife, and he plunged on tactlessly with a knockout blow at that realization. I see in that bit about you loving me. There was a minor frown playing across his lips as she practically jumped in his arms. Her gilded eyes watered in magnificent waves of gold. Her blush swept across her snow-white cheeks, her teeth nibbled on her lower lip in a way that made him want to kiss it, the striking spray of emotion through her expression, which caused him to fixate on every twitch of muscle. Everything about her completely and entirely enthralled him. Ichigo, I don't actually love you. Oh well, that was disappointing. Expected in entirety but disappointing nonetheless. Though, it's not like he felt any surprise. Honestly, he would have replied in the negative as well if she had asked him the same thing. They've only known each other for a handful of months after all. He wasn't one to believe in love at first sight. Infatuation and attraction, sure. But not love. And before he could get a word in, she began an impressive babble on whether or not she actually liked him. It wasn't a word adorable. Yusaka was very different from the other two relationship experiences he had been through. Both of them had been exceptionally physical. Actually, one of them still was, and that was a whole different headache on its own. Yusaka was warm. Exceedingly so. It didn't just come from being a source of spiritual guidance to an entire nation and a facet of the sun. It was the inherent motherly charm that she held in that smile, which sprung up every time Kunu came into sight. Yusaka possessed that loving atmosphere which was so integrally bonded with natural life. That same bond which Ichigo had sorely missed for the last 10 years of his life. His newfound wife was completely different from any other woman he knew. She was soft and compassionate. Unbendingly strong, shouldering the burdens of an entire country while single-handedly raising a daughter in accordance with her beliefs and traditions. Yusaka was the single most remarkable woman he had met. Possibly the single most remarkable person he had ever met. So as she jabbered on fretfully, he couldn't help but dismiss whatever worries he had surmounted in his head when faced with the facts that she had been dealing with this for months. All the while, ruling supernatural Japan as its empress, dealing with invasions from rogue factions of the underworld, and facing the terrible burdens of being a single parent. And she had done so in silence. What right did he have to complain? If anyone had the right to be angry in this situation, it was her. So instead, he began to laugh. He laughed because this amazing woman was dreading what his reaction would be to this monumental mess when she was the one who was most wronged of all. You're laughing? She looked so hopelessly lost that holding back the resulting amusement physically hurt. Though it turned out it was all she needed to push past her own fears as her golden brows scrunched in charming anger. Why are you laughing? Stop it. He didn't know what had gotten into him, but the moment she let loose her little outburst, he couldn't help but throw his head back and roar in laughter. Stop it. She smacked his chest and he was forced to make an effort to control himself. Rolling his neck in a move to contain the bubbling mirth in his chest, Ichigo suddenly knew exactly what he wanted to do in this situation. He flitted a hand through a stray strand of golden hair and said, "Hey Yusaka. I like you." She instantly froze. The irritation in her face melting away as her cheeks heated up. His chest rumbled in a silent levity, but he kept himself composed. "I like you, but I don't think I love you." Angling his head so she could see the sincerity in his eyes, he put both hands on her shoulders. "But I think I might start to." And it was the damn truth. He honestly saw himself falling for this woman if he stayed with her. Isaka mumbled something in response that he wasn't quite able to make it out. Another silent laugh rang clear in his head. Hey. She immediately lifted her head in shy gaze. Why yes. You're such a spoiled princess. And there it was. Her fine golden brows scrunched up and the glint in her eyes honed to keen edges. The corners of full lips downturned, it was an innocent and angry thing that made all the worries and tensions of her life wash away from her eyes. It made her look radiant. I am not SPMMMFFF. So he leaned forward and kissed her. It only lasted for a brief second before Yusaka jerked back and, as both her hands flew to her mouth, she let out a stark, high-pitched squeak of surprise. A flick of the head sent strands of hair out of his eyes and the corners of his mouth curved in with a devilish charm. A small part of him jested that if Yusaka became any redder steam would begin to pour out of her ears. Why don't we start over? He held out a hand. My name's Kurosaki Ichigo. Her eyes drifted towards his hand and held it in question for a moment before one of hers finally fell away from her face. The pads of her fingers slid over his and he slowly skimmed his thumb over her knuckles. Isaka of Kyoto, she said softly while her stare remained transfixed on their joined hands. I see. He responded as equally quiet. Hey Yusaka, would you like to go on a date with me? Instantly, her gaze darted to meet his, surprise flashing through them. She held his stare for a moment as the flush in her cheeks rescinded and she regained her pale pallor. A spark of mischievous intelligence ignited in those golden eyes and, from behind the silk sleeve held to her mouth, he saw her lips move in amusement. I'm not so sure about that, she said thoughtfully. I'm a married woman you see. His lips curved. What's the harm in a little fun? No one has to know. Just you and me. She looked off to the side. Do not smile at me so. They say that there is a dagger in men's smile. He leaned back and blinked in surprise, but a sudden smirk kept to his lips. Then will Milady smile back at me? They also say the rob that smiles steals something from the thief. Her hand fell to her chest in mock appall. Do you think I am easier to be played on than a pipe? This serpent but has a rich honeycomb tongue. Ichigo brought her hand up to his mouth and spoke against her skin. My love's more richer than my tongue, Milady. What good? For a tongue that waggles out of the jaws of death. From his mouth to his heart, Ichigo brought Yusaka's hand down and looked at her pleadingly. I implore you, tempt not a desperate man. He nearly burst out laughing as she gave him a melodramatic sigh. The devil can cite what he wills for his purpose. But we will give him his due all the same. Then shall this be the ecstasy of love? She stood on her knees and leaned forward. Her arms falling onto his shoulder for support and breath coming down to warm the lines of his face. You must promise me to make me your son. It wasn't a plea, but a full-blown ask of conviction. She was telling him that she was placing her trust in him. Slowly his arms came around her waist and he looked up at her, eyes solemn and strong. Ever will I look to the east to see your eyes. Then what's done is done. And she kissed him. It started out slow and chaste, but he allowed it to grow as she fell deeper into it. His arms growing tighter and pulling her closer to him as her golden hair fell about them and hid them away. She was clumsy and awkward, much to Ichigo's surprise, but he relished the fact that she had little to no experience in kissing others. He would teach her how to kiss him. And so his mouth moved, soft and hungry against her small and full lips. Though he made sure not to take it too far. Her lack of experience could easily end up working in his disfavor if he frightened with overt passion. Thus, he pulled back with a teasing flick of his tongue over her lips. Isaka rested her brow against his, and he grinned amusedly as she delicately panted for breath. Her nails dug into his shoulders and he held her tightly. Stay with me? She breathed. Yes. And they kissed again. Turns out, he didn't stay with Yusaka. After 15 minutes of holding her in his arms she had fallen asleep. It had been a challenge shifting her in his arms and navigating through the palace all the way to her bedroom without waking her. When he had seen the line of stress around her eyes, his mouth tasted sour. It only became worse when he finally did carry her into her room. There were papers littered all across the floor. Every single one of them was a prompt of the letter which Kunu had delivered to him. There were dozens of them, scattered to and fro, making a scene completely at odds with her organized and neat nature. The sight had caused his gut to wrench in guilt. Standing in the afternoon sky, he flitted his sight across the Kyoto horizon and let out a sigh. Yusaka's jasmine scent still clung to his clothes even as dark sapphire eyes laughed at him from the back of his mind. He shook his head, not willing to contemplate that inevitable disaster just yet. You know, before I do something stupid enough that the both of us will end up regretting, he said nonchalantly into the empty sky. You'd best act quick. Sunlight beamed down harsher than ever as scorching rays pierced into his skin. Everything seemed to do a tilt-a-whirl and the next thing he knew, he was no longer floating high above the ancient capital of Japan. The sensation of hard rock caused him to look down as his supernaturally enhanced eyes quickly recovered from the severe glow. Deep green moss covered the ground and, as he lifted his head, he found himself surrounded in another world. Parking lot-sized islands floated through the skies, water falling from the edges and cascading into a sea of clouds far, far below. In front of his there was a cobblestone path made of lusterless stone leading up to a massive walled gate. It vaguely reminded him of the Soul Society except for abundance of nature and the lack of white. Taking long strides towards the massive doors, Ichigo quickly found himself being approached by several figures both on land and in sky. Halt. A hulking figure covered in golden armor and dark black wings called loudly. Ichigo sent him an unimpressed look. Creature of the underworld, you are trespassing on these holy lands. Turn back or forfeit your life. He rolled his eyes. Of course she would bring him here without telling any of her personal guard. Well, if that's how she wants it. Ichigo let loose the floodgates, and demonic power crashed through to Kamigahara in a monstrous tidal wave. Dark and malicious powers surged in every direction, discoloring the world, and every single celestial guard around him fell to the ground on their knees. How dare you, one of them growled through gritted teeth. They all were pinned on their hands and knees under the demonic pressure. Without sparing them a glance, Ichigo swept right past them. You're way out of your league. He stopped in front of the black metal doors engraved with two golden dragons, each holding an orb in their claws. Raising a hand and gesturing with one finger, both doors blasted off their hinges with a bang and hurtled forward. There was a terrific crash as they ripped right through the castle walls. A single step ladder and he was standing on top of the tallest pagoda. Looking down at the various running about servants who were screaming, Ichigo couldn't help but frown. Something just wasn't. Their impudence ever grows. A strong voice chided from behind. He cast a glance over shoulder before slowly turning around in full. Beautiful wasn't an accurate word to describe Amaterasu. Impossible was more accurate. With sharp ebony brows, soft and round features and skin so white you could bounce light off of it, everything about her touched the heart. Especially the human heart, and Ichigo ruthlessly pressed down on his. She was dressed differently this time. Instead of rich and layered regalia of vibrant colors, it was simple robe of a pale, misty green. Her rich onyx hair was held in place by phoenix-shaped jade pins, though still it was long enough to hang at her waist. Shifting his weight on one foot, he placed both hands in his pockets. Considering the average height of Japanese people, you're pretty tall. If the randomness of his sentence bothered her, she didn't show it. Are you not quite tall yourself, my son? He shrugged. Supernatural genes. Then you have your answer. Several moments passed where neither of them said anything. Merely her stirring eyes of dark gold meeting his still brown ones. Yet he couldn't help but notice how she constantly swept her gaze over every inch of him. As if she were drinking in the sight of him. Finally, after several minutes she said, you are upset with us. And the way she said it made it seem she was the victim in all of this. Incredibly so, he said with a dry stare. Now the funny thing is, I was downright furious, indignant when I found out at first. After all, anyone would be after having their personal life so thoroughly violated. He'd be the first to admit he was being petty and didn't bother pulling any punches. But I'm me. I can deal with this, no problem. But Yusaka. What you did to her was 1,000 times worse. She doesn't deserve any of this. Yusaka is a reflection of ours. A hint on anger crept into her voice. She is but one of many facets of our glory. It is our right to will for her future. That's bullshit and you know it. His voice echoed loudly over the castle as he took a single powerful step forward and slashed the air in front of him in frustration. If Yusaka is a part of you, then why aren't you trying to make her happy? Why aren't you doing what's best for her? We are. The wave of power accompanying her words instantly disintegrated a good portion of the pagoda tower, and, if it weren't for his quick reflexes in pulling out a dense protective layer, he would have sustained quite a few burns via divine energy. Wonderful, he muttered. Another one of his shirts was ruined beyond repair. He looked about, ready to send Amaterasu a scathing remark, only to find that they were no longer at Kamigahara. Or at least not what he had seen. It was the same mountaintop where he spoken to her for the first time. He cast a quick glance around and found her seated on the old and weathered stone bench underneath a blooming plum tree. She was coldly staring off into the green mountain peaks breaking through the clouds. He sent out a leaden sigh as he saw the bare emotion in her eyes, despite the frigid facade of her set countenance. Women are going to be the death of me, I swear. Well, here's to surviving the next 10 minutes. He rubbed his eyes tiredly and walked over to bench, seating himself in a silent huff. Looking skywards, even though he knew there was no help from anyone up there, he abruptly dropped his head into Amaterasu's lap. 1 second 2 3 he felt her hands begin to comb through his hair and he closed his eyes in a mute sigh while silently congratulating himself on not being smote into a pile of charred ashes. Time is a horrid thing. The inflection of her tone was flat yet, oddly, filled with emotion. The wealthy are condemned to ever continue as the impoverished remain fleeting. Brand from time, on throne immortal. He repeated Tiamat's words to him from a few days back. The old one knows her words well, though she feels this shared pain far better than we do. He decided to remain silent and allowed her to speak, even as her touch silted through his scalp. The children of humanity are magnificent things. To know them, to understand them, to grasp their essential cores, it is to love them. We watch as they grip the greatest of joys and triumphs and labor through the darkest of truths and tribulations and transform them into things of utmost beauty and passion. We watch and they die. She let a sigh and Ichigo felt her trace a finger over the bone of his cheek. Yet even in death, even in the second life of the grave, dare we to keep them in haven and bliss. He clenched his hand tightly as he felt something wet fall onto his cheek. He didn't dare look up though, for fear of his remnant humanity taking over and tumbling into her immortal enthrall. Our son. Her voice was a loving caress as jade-white fingers tenderly stroked his face and he shut his eyes tight. Our beautiful son. How we anguished as the fire, unknown to you, ate at your vitality. Yet we remained patient in accordance to the precepts that governs the undying in the hope that at the end of your mortality, we would raise you into the heavens. That you would shine as a beacon of hope for all of your mortal kin. But our heart did shatter as we were forced to watch you stolen and drowned in shadow. Ichigo bit the inside of his cheeks with enough force to draw blood. What happened? He forced out through clenched teeth. If you'd just tell me, I'd help you. Ever our champion. He could hear the sad smile in her voice. Do not mistake our love for greed or ambition, child. It has long been our desire to see you flourish at our side. Your joining with Yasaka is a glorious thing. Happiness and fulfillment is what we foresaw in your marriage. Never suffering and malice. She is a stubborn thing, and for her daughter and people does she push onwards, even past a scalded heart. His eyes flew open. What? The tale she will tell her husband herself, in due time. Ichigo turned himself over and stared up into her sorrowful face. You're still not telling me why you want me so badly. I don't know you, but I know your legend. I know that you really do love everyone who you see as your children. And I know that every time I see you I see my mother, my real mother, smile back at me. Truly were you blessed by fate with such a son, Masaki. Cool fingers brushed away his bangs and she let out a soft sigh. Had you fully bonded with the first flame, you would understand that the creature known as a hollow is not natural to the world. It is an aberration. A mistake. Hollows? What do you mean they're not natural? His brows furrowed in question. The children of Nihon, our children, are all cursed. If you are familiar with our legend, then you understand why. He searched her face, wondering what she meant before suddenly remembering the tale of Amaterasu's birth. Izanami. Indeed. She nodded gravely. Our blessed father's wife. She cursed all mortals of our lands in vengeance against him. Hence the reason all of our children are born with that abomination known as a soul chain. It is a defiant act against creation to bind a soul. Yet she did so anyway. So that's how hollows came about. Izanami created them. He went to sit up, but Amaterasu held him in place. Apparently she wasn't quite ready to stop playing with his hair. She shook her head. No. The soul chain merely serves a purpose to bind mortals to her, making it impossible to save them from her clutches. However, this all changed little more than 2,000 years ago. 2,000 yay, he began confusedly. However, a realization sharply dawned on him. That's when Soul Society was roughly founded. Yes. She nodded in acknowledgement. Soul Society and the Soul King rose to power because Izanami was slain. What? The word left his throat in a broken whisper. How was that possible? Izanami was a primordial, considerably more powerful than anything Takamagahara or Soul Society had to offer. Tiamat herself was at least 3 times stronger than a Satan-class devil, and she was significantly weaker as a dragon king than as her past self when she was a primordial. What could possibly kill Izanami? What could be? Ichigo turned towards Amaterasu with an alarmed look. Don't tell me. His spiritual mother's mouth said in a grim line as she nodded. Albion and Drag. Chapter 14. Shadows of Immortality. For 1,000 years come and gone since the sealing, though winged shadows from supremacy and domination cast onto the world still. Ichigo flipped himself onto his back as Amaterasu continued to press his hair backwards with her hands. What happened? As ever, she began with a soft sigh. They began a rampage with one another. Upon the hour as we broke the horizon, we beheld them war through the barriers of the living and the dead. They went into the dead lands. His brows arched in surprise. Few, very few, would dare to enter the chthonic realms. The sovereigns of those places had supreme authority over all the denizens of the dead. Any person would be faced with millions of souls as adversaries if they trespassed there. Indeed. Her mouth became tighter with grim lines. Know this, all realms of the dead are connected to one another through many means. Albion and Drag sprung through the fields of Hades and battled north to the halls of Helheim. Eventually, they came over Yama's palace and erupted into our garden through Yomi. I have a feeling that they didn't kill every ruler of the dead on that trailblaze of theirs. So how did Izanami end up one of their unfortunate casualties? A flicker of annoyed exasperation passed through her eyes. Arrogance had long since rotted her mind. Thus, rather than use her power to safeguard her domain as the other lords did, she sought to expel the two and went to confront them. As he opened his mouth to respond to that, he promptly shut it as the full gravity of Amaterasu's words fell on him. She tried to fight them. Those monsters. Suzuchis himself admitted to being considerably weaker than the heavenly dragons in their prime. And Izanami decided to draw the ire of not one, but both of them. Suicide's the word. For his part, Ichigo blinked up at Amaterasu in disbelief as she closed her eyes in a silent sigh. If he didn't know any better, he'd say she was almost embarrassed at the sheer stupidity of her stepmother. The scaled emperors are not known for their mercy, nor their tolerance. They quickly tore her body apart and scattered her immortal essence throughout Yomi. She shook her head in a weary annoyance. So complete was her obliteration that never again shall her consciousness form coherently. Much less form a body. So she's not dead. His brow furrowed in question. The soft finger traced the edge of his face. Immortal is no empty boast. Her essence returned to the laws from whence she came. What she once was lingers in those eldritch truths, yet it stays but a faded imprint. If those same laws gave birth once more, it would not be to the same entity as before. Gone, but not dead then, he said shrewdly. As he went to sit up, Amaterasu placed her hands on his shoulders and held him down. He defied those imperious eyes with an annoyed glare, and they held each other in a silent standoff. In a simultaneous fashion, both raised a single eyebrow in challenge of the other. The very tense moment passed before the corners of her lips curved. Such an impudent child. Never before have we been so openly defied. Not even your uncles would dare to behave in such an impertinent manner. He stretched the soreness out of his back. Stone did not make for a comfortable bed. Yeah. Well, all the power to you for running your house, but someone's gotta keep your ego in check. Is that so? When he craned his neck to look at her, he found her facing him with a wolfish grin. It was decidedly unsettling. So about the hollows. He was eager to put the topic back on track. How did Izanami's death cause them to come to be? She turned away from him and he followed her gaze to the various green mountain peaks that broke through the grey cloud sea. Regardless of the hatred she held for our children, she was still the ruler of Yomi. Without her presence, it quickly began to fall apart and wane. The boundary between the living and dead was swiftly failing. Had no action been taken, the two planes of reality would have merged into one another and utterly collapsed the balance of the world. This earth fell into dire peril. But you stopped it, he said slowly. And I'm assuming Soul Society came about from that. Nay. She turned to him with a smile. The collapsing of the boundary was beyond our strength to correct. What? He leaned back with a questioning look. Then who fixed it? Wait, was it the Soul King? Is that why he's in charge of Soul Society? Her hair waved in a raven-like shimmer as she shook her head. No, child. It was not our old friend. It was Albion and Dreg. What? That was entirely unexpected. Those two rioting dragons actually fixed one of the many messes they caused. Golden eyes shone with mirth. They are not as heartless as history would have you believe. Undoubtedly, yes, they care little for the suffering of those beneath them, but annihilation is not their desire, nor is it acceptable to them. What did they do then? He asked absently while his mind still attempted to process the devastating duo doing something nice. They're old, child. So terribly old. Long before any of the Undying proclaimed sovereignty over humanity, they were soaring through skies unknown and unheard of. Through countless ages unseen they have gained an understanding of the precepts that govern creation. Few can match their insight and wisdom. Not for naught are they titled heavenly dragons. She reached out with a hand and cupped his cheek, slowly stroking it with her thumb. With ancient power, they bended and bound the formations that administered Yomi and presented them to us. Upon their direction, we were to have another take Izanami's place. Yet, who would have the daring to forever abandon the celestial planes and condemn themselves to Yomi? The Soul King, he said with realization. A hint of sadness crawled into her eyes. A dear and greatly cherished friend of ours. So noble and ever filled with laughter in those days, he stepped forward and offered to take the burdens of the dead. And so, by our decree and his unwavering will, he became king of the dead. She stopped there, her hands still on his face, but her eyes looking so very far away. He reached up and took a hold of her hand. What happened? His strength was great but not great enough. He is, after all, not a true king of the dead. It is no meek thing to shoulder that particular domain. Merely assuming the role cost him tremendously and he was barely able to restructure Yomi into Soul Society. However, he could not force his resolve on the entirety of the realm. Hueco Mundo. Along with the Valley of Screams and other places, yes. She nodded. Our friend became the Soul King and assumed the responsibility of the cycle of souls. However, her finger tightened around his and her mouth set somberly. Though she no longer remained, Izanami's venom still ran through the eddies of Nihon. Understand, a primordial is a reflection of the world. Even when gone, their will may yet linger and continue to sway the spheres of influence they once held. And through this, her curse remained. You had no idea that the soul chain was still affecting every human soul in Japan, did you? She remained quiet for a while, a silent fury and indignation broiling in her eyes. We had no knowledge that a curse would still play its part, and through our ignorance, thousands of hollows were born in a matter of days. Ichigo looked at the ground in silent wonder. The original purpose of the soul chain was to drag human souls down into depths of Yomi. However, with no one pulling on the other side, the haunting remnants of Izanami corroded the souls they were bound to. It finally made sense to him now. Ever since he became a devil and awoke his connection with hell, he had become intimately familiar with the nature of souls. There was simply no possible way for a soul to become so corrupted after death and not be taken by hell. Although, if there was an outside intervention, then that was a whole different story. If the soul chain contained the fragments of her vile desires, then it was hardly surprising that a soul would so quickly fall into madness without the Shinigami to deliver them from their fate. So this is where the Shinigami first came into being. The handmaidens of Izanami perished with their mistress, and it was urgent that they be replaced. Many of the souls already in Yomi, now freed from Izanami's tyranny, gave their loyalty to the far more benevolent Soul King. They became the forebearers of the Soul Society and the first incarnation of the Gate 13. Those early days were filled with nothing but slaughter as hollows came into being by the drove. She fell silent and Ichigo was left to mull over his thoughts. And the reason? His words came slowly and carefully. You and the Soul King are so adamant of keeping Soul Society separate the rest of the world is because. The line formed on her brow and his heart lurched in response. The balance maintained by the Soul King is very delicate. It cannot withstand the might of foreign powers. If mystical forces alien to his begin entering Soul Society, we fear he will no longer be able to hold the afterlife together. The cycle of souls will break. Flashes of Aizen's final screams against Urahara resurfaced. It came as little surprise that those two knew the intricate shadows behind Soul Society and, undoubtedly, Old Man Yama knew too. It was for no small reason that Soul Society had become so anal about its laws. Surprisingly, so much treaded on the edge of a knife. Wait a minute, his eyes flashed in deliberation. Right after his treachery was revealed, Aizen claimed that the throne of heaven was empty and he was planning on taking it for himself. He absolutely did know about the Soul King situation. Could that have been why he went so far? Was that why he was flapping on about transcending? He was going to use them Jyoku to transform his human soul into a divine one. He quickly shook his head of such thoughts. What's done is done. There was little point of fixating himself on things already dealt with. The Soul King will have to step down. He asked. He has spent over 2,000 years in endless toil, yet even his great strength has its end. We fear and grieve for him as the currents of the future are slowly becoming bleak and disconcerting. How long his reign will continue we cannot foresee. The throne of the dead must have a king. And it hit him like a fucking train as she stared hard at him. He gave her an incredulous stare. You can't be serious. With suitable heritage and an affinity granted by the first flame, is it not appropriate? She finished on a delicate note. No. He objected strongly. Very strongly. It isn't appropriate at all. Why not? She casually asked with challenge. Because I said so. He shot to his feet and quickly let go her hand. She had to be insane. Why else would she propose such a ridiculous and, admittedly, terrifying idea? There was no way in hell he was going to go along with that crazy of a plan. How very eloquent of you, Ichigo. Now sit back down, you are acting quite juvenile. You're 100 times older than me. I'll damn well act juvenile if I want to, he said irritably as he began to pace back and forth. Child. And something in the way that usually warm and charming voice became layered with ice stopped him in his place. Do not believe for one meager instant that you have become so powerful that we are unable to bend you over our knee and administer discipline. Right, super powerful entity capable of reducing entire countries to ashes in minutes if given the proper motivation. He took a moment, dragging a drained hand over his face and through his hair. Sitting down, he pinned her with a flat stare. You want me to become the next Soul King? Essentially. Oh, sweet Lucifer. You are serious? Yes. He snorted. She didn't even hesitate in the least. Wonderful. Between you and Surziches, I'll be ruling the planet by the end of the year. We pay little heed to the paltry games of the three factions, and the fallen one's personal business is of even less concern. You're being seated on the throne of the dead, such has been our desire since 5 years past. He gestured broadly with his arms. You know there is that teensy tiny detail of me being a devil. I can't exactly become divine on a whim. We have our means, she said cryptically. He stared at her blankly for a second before tightly shutting his eyes and squeezing his temples between a forefinger and thumb. So let me get this straight. The lids of his eyes still heavy and firmly shut. The heavenly dragons kill Izanami and put the world one step away from the walking dead. They decide they like the world and save it from being overrun with a zombie apocalypse. You crown the Soul King as well, the Soul King, and the next thing everybody knows, there are hollows everywhere. Soul Society is born and, flash forward 2000 years later, I just happened to fill in the criteria for solving the big issue of a weakening Soul King. So you marry me to Yasaka to build a permanent tie to Japan when I, inevitably, outlive most everyone from my human life. She gave him a dry look. A very crude summary. However, accurate, nonetheless. He could feel a muscle at the corner of his right eye twitch violently. He dropped his head into his hands and groaned quite audibly. Clumsily dragging his face out of his palms, he sent a serene stare out into the ocean of clouds. I might just become an alcoholic at this rate, he said in calm epiphany. Your fascination with the English playwright has left you quite the dramatist. Thanks, I'll add to that list of ever-growing issues in my life. He drawled as he pinched the bridge of his nose. The Madarasu let out a musical mirth. Perhaps you'd best return to the mortal world and think things over. Suddenly, she tilted her head as if attempting to discern some elusive sound. Ah yes, it is definitely time for you to return. One of your issues is approaching calamity. I'm going to regret asking. His tone curt and sullen. But what happened now? Red and gorgeous lips didn't so much smile as they curved into a voracious baring of teeth. The old one is conversing with Yasaka. His stomach hit the floor and all brain activity ceased to function. Only one lonely dark thought remained. I'm fucking dead. His symbolic mother gave a throaty laugh and a warm feeling permeating through both cheeks brought him out of the various doomsday scenarios playing through his mind. Ichigo. He blinked back into reality and saw her hand softly cupping his face. Although her lips were still twisted in mirth, her eyes shone with profound and tranquil emotion. That we could keep you in our arms forever we would, but fate has played a cruel hand. He didn't know what to say, and that human heart of his began to thud with vigor. Ever does your future become more obscure to our eyes. We fear that a great darkness will descend upon you all too soon. He looked away from her, and Ichigo swallowed the emotion beginning to curl up his throat. But it all broke through the metaphorical dam as she leaned forward and pressed her lips to his forehead. Be safe, my son. The blinding gold light enveloped him, and the first thing Ichigo did was reach out to Tiamat with his mind. There were dozens of things frantically occupying Yasaka's mind. The obvious and abrupt change in her relationship with Ichigo. The question of how they would continue on in the future as husband and wife. The rather heated and never to be admitted highly enjoyable kiss they shared. Nevertheless, all of the occurrences of the early afternoon paled in comparison to smiling serpentine eyes of Dragon King Tiamat. She had woken up in her bed, which embarrassingly meant Ichigo had carried her into her bedroom, and the very first thing she had seen was that terrifying ocean blue gaze. The primordial was seated on the open windowsill as her angular chin rested on her palm. Slender and polished fingers tapped the side of her jaw with an excruciating slowness. Long white hair shadowed one side of her face as it sprayed across her shoulder and clashed fantastically with her dark skin. Swallowing the lump of uneasiness in her throat, Yasaka cautiously slid her legs against the bedsheets and moved to stand up. As soon her feet touched the floor, a surge of lightning darkened the world and the resulting boom shook the palace walls. No doubt, all of Kyoto and the surrounding prefecture was now drowning in a sudden freak storm. She slowly took a step away from her bed and righted her clothes, all the while those slit eyes tracked her every movement. A feral smile curved Tiamat's lips. I'm sleeping with your husband. Yasaka flinched as another crack of lighting cleaved the sky behind the seated dragon. Hands clenched tightly at her sides, she lifted her chin imperiously. He told you then. Not in the least. Tiamat continued. I knew long before he did. She blinked in surprise. How? Aside from myself, only Lady Amaterasu knew and I highly doubt she told you anything. The side of the Dragon King's lip split, revealing honed and pointed teeth. Hardly. As if I would seek out that overgrown candle in the sky. Her eyes narrowed dangerously. I will not tolerate disrespect of Amaterasu-sama. The fine white brow rose, and a silent but tyrannical pressure fell over the world. Tolerate. Child, I've consumed things older and far more powerful than you. You may believe that the intersecting veins of the earth may grant you the strength to suppress me, but it is only a futile endeavor. Golden chakra surged through Yasaka as she pressed back. The clang of the two women's auras clashing caused a heated friction to build and the ground to roll with power. You do not possess the capabilities to leave this city unscathed. She then gave a vicious smile. Well, not anymore, you don't. Tiamat's gaze darkened considerably and her power surged as the sky behind her began to swirl in a monstrous vortex of wind and rain. Just as Yasaka was about to retaliate by drawing forth a lee line, a single word scattered the gathering power in the room. Peace. The divine decree shifted the world in favor of the immortal's will, and rays of golden sunlight burst through the churning mass of clouds. Tiamat did not look back but let out a discontent snort. For her part, Yasaka stared wide-eyed as the space next to her twisted and twirled. Ever so slowly, the image of Amaterasu solidified and the sun embodied stood in her paper-littered bedroom. The presence of the ancient deity struck across the skies and filled the world with holy mandate. Isaka immediately fell to her knees and folded her hands in her sleeves, bowing her head forward in obeisance. This one greets her ladyship. 1,000 tributes to her sacred majesty. Rise, child. Amaterasu said kindly. And cease your toils. This is a foe you cannot hope to face. Isaka immediately obeyed, though a small part of her twinged in dissatisfaction. While Tiamat vastly outstripped her in power, it was possible to trap her with the power of the earth veins. Amaterasu sent her a knowing smile, and her patron's voice resounded in her head. An effort in vain, young one. The old one is all too knowledgeable in regards to the lines of power in the earth. It would be child's play for her to wrest control of them from you. Her mouth went dry at that particular revelation. The greatest of the Dragon Kings was already a monstrous force to contend with. But if she had the added strength of the ley lines, all of Japan would be sunk into the sea by this hour tomorrow. You make a dangerous gamble, youngling. Yusaka's gaze flicked to Tiamat, who glared accusingly at Lady Amaterasu. Gone are the days when your ilk would openly step through the mortal world. I fear that all eyes now are watching this place. Much to Yusaka's shock, Amaterasu inclined her head towards the terse dragon. It has been a long time, old one. Tiamat said nothing and merely stared at the ruler of the Shinto. Several moments passed and, finally, she scoffed as she turned her head away. Has it? Did we not meet at my son's palace not long ago? Isaka took a step back from the conversation, knowing full well that she was entirely out of her depth as the powerhouses took center stage. Amaterasu smiled. A trifle span for you, yet the 300 years since the banquet at the palace of Rikjin is no small passage of time for us. Tiamat let out a deep hum from her chest as another moment of silence passed. A breeze filled the room as the Dragon King shifted so that her back was pressed to the frame of the window. You have utterly dumbfounded my little master. It took Yusaka a moment to realize that Tiamat was referring to Ichigo. She had nearly forgotten that the woman wasn't just Ichigo's possible lover, but his actual familiar. You are listening to our conversation, then? A hint of disapproval in Amaterasu's voice fell into Yusaka's ears, and she observed her mother figure out of the corner of her eyes. So Ichigo was into Kamigahara. Which meant that Amaterasu-sama, most likely, was revealing the truth of Soul Society and the failing Soul King at this very moment. In a brief moment of childishness, she couldn't help but feel jealous of her matron. The ability to be in multiple places at once would vastly help decrease her workload. He has grown used to leaving our minds open to one another. A twitch of irritation crossed her lips as Yusaka watched a dragon lift her hand and disinterestedly begin to inspect her nails. But you have no need to be so indignant. The matter of your dead has long been known to me. The decay of this land is all too visible to mine eyes, as well as the might of the scaled emperors that holds it in check, though the matter of his marriage to this baby girl. And Yusaka's eye twitched in annoyance at the epithet. I managed to glisten from his memories. Despite your tampering. There are no regrets, Amaterasu said stiffly. We have done as we saw best for these two children. Perhaps. Tiamat pursed her lips. I will not deny that he will only grow stronger from this, and you are not incorrect in your desire to give him that throne. He would make a fine dead king. What? Isaka rapidly covered her mouth in mortification, but still couldn't help flick her gaze back and forth between the two ancient women. Amaterasu gave an irritated sigh, while Tiamat sent her an infuriatingly mocking grin. Did you not know? The primordial said with patronizing pity. Your marriage was a maneuver to instill ties to my young master, once all his human family and friends have embraced death. You are the chain that may pull him from the ranks of the lords of the underworld onto the thrones of the dead. That. Amaterasu shot Tiamat a stern glare before turning to her. Is not the truth in entirety. Your marriage to our son has indeed given him strong ties to his ancestral home. But the happiness meant to be instilled between the two of you was ever in our eyes. Isaka's mouth twisted wryly. Truthfully, she was all too used to immortal politics. While there was never any outright lying done, those proclaiming divinity saw deceit beneath them, there was much doublespeak and misdirection involved. Not to mention hidden intentions. We would ask. Amaterasu's dry voice breaking Yusaka from her thoughts and causing her to lift her gaze from the floor. That you, old one, step aside and allow the union of these two to flourish. Yet the foolishness of such a request is evident. White hair swept away with one hand, the eldest of the three hummed in amusement. His choices are his own. I will offer him no direction, though if he asks for it, my counsel is his. And in regards to his bed. And here she paused while smiling with predatory intent. Unless he outright turns me away, then I will continue to share it with him. He is Yusaka's husband, Amaterasu insisted. Not by choice and certainly not by love. Isaka cringed as her heart burned with a landed blow. Tiamat might as well have slapped her with the entirety of her strength for all the difference it would have made. Do not despair, child. The dragon gave her a shockingly kind expression. He holds considerable affection for you. It may blossom into love yet. The words felt entirely alien to her. Not so much for what was being said but, rather, who was saying them. That's against your nature. The ruler of Kyoto stated matter-of-factly. That may be so, but I understand him far better than you. So much for being kind. An aggravated voice stated in her head as Yasaka's forehead wrinkled in displeasure. Tiamat gave a knowing smile and continued on regardless. Bitch. Amaterasu's lips twitched from the corner of her eyes, though both of them set their attention to the dragon looking out the window. He would sooner end any and all romance than having to face the prospect of choosing one and having to forever desolate the other. I do not believe either of us is willing to accept such an outcome. Damn straight. Yasaka was set on making Ichigo her husband in more than just name. That young man was the only viable candidate to appear in the last 400 years to possibly fill that position. Not to mention how good he was for her daughter. Then the matter of Ichigo is settled. Amaterasu asked with a pointed stare. For now. Tiamat nodded with a small smile. Then I will return Ichigo to your tender graces. Yasaka smirked as Tiamat let out a laugh. Undoubtedly her husband would have a meltdown when he saw the two of them together. One thing before you do, young one. The laughter receded and was replaced by a thoughtful light in those sapphire eyes. The world is moving once more. Certainly, you have sensed it, but the change goes deeper than I believe your generation can see. Many of my kindred are stirring. Both primordial as well as wormkin. My master will unfailingly be standing at the center with the others this new age will revolve around. We have felt the stirring and the future does ever become more obscured. Our focus, however, remains on our garden. The world will have to fend for itself, as it always has. Tiamat agreed with a nod. But this will be unlike any other shift in recent memory. The Heavenly Father's legacy will ensure the ascending of humanity to new realms. Creatures so old that even I have forgotten them are rising from whatever dark crevices they have hid themselves in. Even the darkness beyond death has brought forth a representative in the form of our mutual love. And above all, the dream and the infinite have broken their long silence. Isaka sucked in a cold breath as she went deathly still. Even Amaterasu-sama looked paler than her usual fair color. The Divine Two had finally emerged after centuries of indifference for the world. The last time one of them had made an appearance was 300 years ago, when the Apocalypse Dragon had briefly rested right here in Japan. One of the most devastating earthquakes in the country's history, along with a massive eruption of sacred Mount Fuji, occurred all because it sneezed. Your words will be heeded, old one. We thank you for your wisdom. Though the speech was probably sincere, Yasaka could tell that Amaterasu-sama was deeply concerned with what she had just learned. Your gratitude is unneeded. The blunt dragon waved away rudely. Rikyan has been offered your generosity and compassion. This is my gift for taking care of my son. Now you best be off. Ichigo has just promised me a delightful meal of which the likes I've never tasted before so long, as the girl is alive and unharmed once he arrives. Isaka, along with Amaterasu, glared at the dragon as the latter faded from existence. The part of her felt like pulling off the tearfully frightened girl act and having Ichigo stay for dinner while he booted the incredibly arrogant dragon back into the underworld. She knew that he was immensely uncomfortable with weeping females and would cave immediately if confronted with one. It would certainly teach the impolite primordial a lesson. Friends that they were, it was still rare for all four of them to gather in a single place. So often were they busy with the responsibilities heaved onto their shoulders or whatever other fancy that managed to catch their eye. But Surzich's had demanded their presence and, knowing him so well, they knew he would wickedly pester them endlessly until they gave in. What other choice did they have if they wanted any peace in the foreseeable future? You're set on this then? He turned his amused eyes towards the rich and cultured tone of Ijuka, ever layered with boredom. His oldest friend sat with his back straight as he idly toyed with a shifting sphere of bronze gears and magic circles with one hand. I am. He responded as he put two fingers to his lips. And you are certain that the boy is able? Ijuka's eyes finally lifted to meet his as he dissipated his gizmo with a flick of the wrist. I wouldn't have trodden this road if I thought otherwise. He leaned back into his throne and continued in an amused drawl. Not that you haven't kept a careful watch on him, yourself. Ijuka's lips twitched even as Seraphal's voice carried over. She absently flicked a thread of hair that she had been playing with and gave a dry stare. As if you can blame us. Keeping your little toy so close to you at all times and sheltering him from others who would dissuade him from your machinations. Better my machinations than your bedroom games, Sarah. Besides. Surzicha smiled impishly. You know how I hate to share. She returned his look with an identical one of her own before glancing over at the remaining member of their party. And what of you, Falbium? What are your thoughts on all this? The sin of sloth had swung his legs over the arm of his throne in a blatant effort to fall asleep. Surzich's resisted the urge to snort as the youngest of the four of them jerked his head up from its undulating dance. Eyes of staunch and lifeless gray spun in their sockets, landing on each of them before settling on Seraphal. What does it matter, Sarah? He said with a noncommittal shrug. I doubt Surzich's would be foolish enough to try something like this on a mere whim, and, you have to admit, the prospects of this falling through are entertaining enough. Careful there, dear brother. Ichigo cut in with apparent mirth in his voice. If I didn't know any better, I'd say you're actually excited about something. How atypical of you. Surzicha stifled a laugh even as Serafel gave a roguish curve of her lips. Falbium frowned and answered with a slight touch of indignation. Hardly. Yet, you have to admit the monotony of the last few decades have been grating if anything. After all, what are we devils without our sense of theatrics? I'd assume we'd all be you, if that were the case. Surzicha's intoned with a smirk. Falbium rolled his eyes but cut himself off halfway through the motion as he suddenly yawned. Shaking his head from the bout of drowsiness no doubt settling in, he ran a hand through his dark hair, pushing it back and clearing his brow. Yes, well, if you're all quite done with having your fun at my expense, I think I'll be leaving. He then turned his eyes toward Surzicha's and spoke. You have my support in this ridiculous scheme of yours. Which, no doubt, ends with little Ria's engagement to the phoenix whelp broken in two. Surzicha's frowned considerably. Now that's just plain untrue. His denial earned him 3 very unbelieving stares. Well. He shifted uncomfortably in his seat. Maybe it's a possible desirable outcome from this venture but not the main reason. Highly unlikely. Ichigo scoffed. Serafel merely shook her head and Falbium closed his eyes and placed his arms behind his head. If that's all, I'm off. Ta-ta. And with that, the Lord Asmodeus disappeared in a puff of purplish black smoke. Ichigo gave a chuckle even as he shook his head. If anything, I will have to concur with Falbium. This will certainly be the most excitement we've had for quite nearly a full century. And on the plus, if this pans out, my workload will certainly lessen and free up more time for my experiments. On that, we can both agree upon. Serafel said with a nod. Not only that, but with this, Surzichas can no longer hide away his boy. I am eager to meet the one who has garnered the affections of Dragon King Tiamat herself. And what do you make of that, Ichigo? Serafel threw a sharp look at the Lord Beelzebub. You've had dealings with her in the past. Can you discern her intentions? Surzichas carefully observed Ichigo from the corner of his eyes. He knew that his oldest and closest friend had more than simple dealings with the monstrously beautiful Tiamat over the years. Ichigo responded slowly, obviously considering his words. I will reserve my judgment for now. Though I will say that, if anything, she is merely repeating a process ongoing for millennia. Serafel pursed her lips as Ichigo's guarded answer was apparently not what she was hoping for. If there's nothing else. Ichigo shifted and sat straighter. I must return to the labs. It will be no small miracle if nothing undesirable has occurred in my absence. When Surzichas gave him a nod, Ichigo responded in kind and merely faded from sight in a hazy shimmer. Well, I guess that's that, said the last of his companions. How is Sona doing? Surzichas said suddenly, allowing some of the severity in his eyes to melt away. Serafel blinked before smiling warmly. She's fine. I spoke with her this morning. She made some vague reference to running for some sort of elected office or such. Looking entirely bemused, Surzichas leaned his cheek onto a bent fist. Really now? I had no idea that Sona was interested in politics. I doubt it's anything too fussy. Serafel wrinkled her nose. My Sona is far more suited to the endless nightmares of bureaucracy than actually bearing leadership. Oh? Surzichas rose a single red eyebrow. From what Riaz has told me, Sona is quite the accomplished king. Granted, neither of them have any actual experience in these matters. She gave a low sigh. For all her impressive deductive reasoning, my younger sister has yet to grasp one core concept of the supernatural. We thrive on the unknown and the unexpected. That it is the enigma and the unprecedented and that which cannot ever be accounted for that truly makes our world turn. She is still young, both of our respective sisters are. And we will watch over them, giving them the allowance to make their mistakes and grow, still yet. Too true. She mumbled as her gaze went off to the side. A slight silence settled over the two of them until Serafel rose from her throne. She cast glance at Ichigo's and Falbium's thrones before leaning backwards and stretching her shoulders. So used to her antics, Surzichas didn't even blink as she gave him a rather fantastic view of her impressive bust. She briefly wiggled her hips, ridding herself of the soreness of their unforgivingly uncomfortable seats, and settled on giving him a mischievous smile. Try not to cause too many issues for us Surzichas. Who? Me? He gave her a centuries perfected look of pure innocence. Yes you moronic buffoon. She rolled her eyes at him playfully. I need to get back to the set and come up with some new ideas. Ratings fell by a whole 0.2% last week. Oh the horror. Surzichas spoke wryly. Whatever will the underworld do if your television series isn't #1 in the ratings? Oh shut up, you useless jerk. He rolled his eyes as she stuck out her tongue. Some of us actually work hard at what we do instead handing it all off to our servants. The sheer hypocrisy of the statement made even him, the bloody prince of lies, gape openly. She gave him a saucy wink and struck a ridiculous pose. Give Milik his my love. Surzichas paused before nodding in bemused acknowledgement. Seraphol erupted into a monstrous display of pink smokescreen and rainbow archways. He then tilted his head as he regarded the literal shooting stars of electric blue. That's a new effect, she didn't have them before. He shook his head at her childish display and swept his eyes across the room in a circle. 3 empty thrones, each emblazoned with a glowing emblem of their master's insignia. Then his eyes landed on another empty throne. This one lacking symbol and stood plain and simple without any decoration or regalia. Still. Surzichas mused to himself as his lips curved nefariously. 5 out of 7 is better than 4. Chapter 15. Lords of the Underworld. Pass me that blue bowl over there, would you? Ichigo stared at her incredulously. That's your reaction. I just told you my life's basically over. Grafia rolled her eyes in exasperation, much to his annoyance. You are being overdramatic, Ichigo. Your life has hardly been ruined. Turned on its head, understandable, but not ruined. Now kindly pass me that bowl before I am forced to smack you upside the head. He quietly grumbled as he reached out and passed her the freshly washed vegetables. Recently returned from keeping Yasaka and Tiamat from leveling Kyoto, Ichigo immediately set about making good on his promise to the ancient Dragon King. Hence, he fessed up everything that had happened to Grafia in return for her assistance in cooking up a meal that would appease Tiamat's voracious appetite and, hopefully pacify her sour mood. Admittedly, Yasaka was also quite visibly upset when he decided to return to the underworld with his familiar. The moment he opened a portal for Tiamat and himself, Yasaka had averted her gaze as tears welled up in her eyes. There was no room for denial. He panicked, as if he had just been caught committing a felony. He had firmly promised her to spend all of next weekend with her, causing Tiamat to growl from behind ferociously. Of course, as soon as he made that promise, he remembered that it was the same weekend where he would be facing Barbados and his peerage. So, with having reneged on the promise he made 10 seconds beforehand, Yasaka became even more upset. Suffice it to say, he crumbled to every request of hers that came after, which left Tiamat in a heavily vexed mood. The dragon had locked herself into his bedroom and refused to talk to him. A soft thud reverberated through the kitchen as Ichigo smacked his forehead against the countertop. Grafia's cool touch briefly sifted over his scalp. Please don't damage my kitchen. On second thought, feel free to do so. I've been looking for an excuse to change the color scheme and redecorate. Happy to be of assistance, he muttered dryly. Ichigo. He lifted his head to find Grafia giving him a stern glare. You're overthinking things. You are hardly the first man in history, supernatural or human, to find himself with more than one woman in his life. To your credit, they came to you, not the other way around. He heaved a sigh as he dragged a hand over his face. I don't want to hurt them or drive them away. And so long as you keep thinking like that, it won't happen. She nodded sharply as she turned around and lifted a sizable knife. The sharp edge blurred as it made mincemeat out of the assorted vegetables. It can hardly be that easy, he quipped dryly. No, it most certainly is not. She shook her head gently. However, it requires far less toil and heartache than what you are envisioning. How can you be so sure? He snorted. I'm quite positive that if Surzichas brought home a girl you'd tear him apart. He regretted the words even as they left his mouth. A sudden chill settled into the air and the knife in her hands became deathly still. Surzichas, her tone soft and even, knows all too well how to properly behave. I've spent a lot of time ensuring as much. The last part was uttered so quietly, he was barely able to make it out, but he did nonetheless, and he shivered. Several moments passed as Grafia's hands moved once more and the kitchen was filled with the soft crunch of food being taken apart with economic precision. If I may offer a piece of advice, Ichigo. She said with deliberate ease, breaking the silence which had settled between the two of them. By all means. Perhaps, her words came slow and cautious, you must simply give all of this time. You are approaching this with a human's mentality and perspective. Though you can hardly be blamed for that, young as you are. Time, huh? He looked off to the side, allowing his thoughts to settle. Perhaps he was looking at this the wrong way. Regardless of this afternoon's shocking revelations, there was no damning piece which coerced him into any sort of commitment. While Yasaka's and his own view on society weren't too different, there was still enough of a disparity from living in the supernatural world for 400 years, which set her apart from him. It granted her a much more fluid ease in transitioning to their newfound lifestyles. Tiamat, on the other hand, did not share any of the same perspectives as he did. She had outlived many social norms, along with their proprietors, and she would outlive this one too, most likely. The frightening thought, eventually he too would outstrip the current models of human society. Albeit, that was decades to come. Essentially speaking, he wasn't required to do anything. What he did have to do was simply keep on living his life and not make any damning choices in regards to either of the two women he held strong affections for. His eyes flitted over the granite pattern of the counter as he quietly voiced his thoughts, just go along for the ride, huh? He suddenly felt a cool sensation press across his cheek. Tracking the pale white hand, his eyes met with Grafia's silver stare as she regarded him, a rare look of softness. You're young. Don't fill your life with such dark worries just yet. Live your life and enjoy yourself. A hint of her customary severity returned and caused her gaze to sharpen. Mind you, that doesn't mean you should frolic about irresponsibly. Do keep your head on your shoulders, Ichigo. He gave a light chuckle. Thanks, you're the best. It's what family is for. Grafia gently pecked her lips on his cheek. Now make yourself useful. Her smile was swiftly replaced with a casual indifference as a bowl of diced vegetables was rudely shoved under his nose. Grab that piece of ginger, she pointed with her chin, and grated into all of this. He blinked in confusion. What? However, she paid him no heed. Once you're done with that, take that knife and crush that piece of garlic with the side of the blade and throw it in. Mix it all thoroughly and be generous with the olive oil when you add some. While you're at it, give a nice splash of red wine to color and a bit of aroma. He continued to stare at the woman blankly, causing her to place a hand on her hip and usher on him with the fingers of her other hand. Don't just sit there like an unresponsive brick. Get to work. Yeah, sure. He fumbled with the bowl in his hands as he moved down to the cutting board where the ginger and garlic lay. While you do that, I'll marinate the manticore steaks. Yes ma'am, he mumbled half-heartedly. Watching an entire mountain disappear in a monstrous pillar of flame made for quite the sight. Unfortunately, Ichigo didn't quite have the luxury of appreciating the spectacle as Sutra II came crashing down at him from above. He jumped back, high into the air even as the earth shattered down below. An entire section, the size of a soccer field, was torn apart in a matter of seconds. Mammoth slabs of rock and gritty dust flew into the air, obscuring his view. Only a veteran sense born of numerous battles allowed him to reflexively raise Anjetsu in time as cold demonic steel slammed into the white flat of his blade. Ichigo looked into the sharp and grim lines within Saoji's eyes as the Shinsengumi captain pressed his full weight onto their locked swords. You're going to have to speed up unless this is the best you can do, my young friend. Ichigo smirked in response and the two disappeared in a supersonic burst. As they ripped through the sky, his eyes tracked every movement of the samurais, no matter how trivial it seemed. Saoji was a master of misdirection, capable of leading the opponent's attention elsewhere and instantly striking somewhere entirely else. With every burst of ultra-high-speed step, their respective swords met in a shower of sparks, and each impact resulted in a shockwave that thundered in a peal across the underworld. You done gone and ignored me. Done go and make me angry lads. Ichigo jumped back from his exchange with Saoji as he briefly zipped his eyes down toward Sutra and the flaming crater he was standing in. The fire giant took in a deep breath, his chest swelling as he did so, and let out a bestial roar as fire spewed from his mouth. The virtual tsunami of flame roared to life as it colored the sky a dark burnt orange and ripped its way towards the two swordsmen. Ichigo swore loudly as both he and Saoji drew in demonic power onto their swords. The searing wall of fire was far too massive and moving far too quickly for them to dodge. Their only option was to meet it head-on. With a loud cry they both swung their blades, letting loose a flood of demonic energy to clash with Sutra's fire. The twin waves of power met with the conjured fire and instantly, the forces violently ruptured on collision. The resulting explosion detonated with a nuclear force and blew everything in the vicinity to ashes and rubble. Ichigo shielded his eyes from the glowing fire as he rapidly soared higher and farther away from the still climbing cloud of smoke and power. The roar from the still erupting force deafened him and sheer tremor made him entirely blind to any possible movements around. The density of wild and destructive energy in the air made it impossible for him to sense where the other two had gotten to. Several moments passed where his eyes moved to and fro, attempting to discern any enemy movement when suddenly the ash cloud tore apart as Sutra came hurtling at him at breakneck speeds. That fucking hurt, damn it. The massive flame-covered hand of Sutra swiped down at his head, forcing him to step back. However, he was a tad bit too slow in his movements and the giant's fingers grazed against the left side of his chest. With his enhanced vision Ichigo glared as, in near slow motion, the burning fingers burned right through his clothes and seared their way into his flesh. Fuck. He clenched his teeth as a 3-inch trench of burned flesh screamed in agony, incapable of regenerating due to the heavy presence of Sutra's magic. The giant made another lunge at him, however, instead of dodging, Ichigo went forward into the rook's personal space and lashed out with his foot. Crashing against the heavily muscled chest, Ichigo let out a roar as demonic power flared and pressed down on the giant. Despite the incredible force behind his kick, which would have sent any other opponent sailing through the sky, Sutra only fell back a few paces. Yet, it was enough for Ichigo maneuver openly as the Norse giant lunged at him once more. He deftly dodged the soot-covered arm of the giant and kicked it away. Twisting himself in midair so that he was facing Sutra hanging upside down, Ichigo pointed his index finger into Norse giant's face. His eyes crisscrossed and fixed on the charging beam inches from the tip of his nose, Sutra managed to let out a growling curse. Fuck you, laddie. Fuck you. The Zero ripped off of the point of Ichigo's finger and pummeled right into giant, pushing down further and further. Halfway to the ground, Ichigo could feel the rook fight back against the force of the energy burst. Nevertheless, he tore open the locks and let his mammoth reserves of demonic power free. The Zero nearly doubling in width, it bulged against Sutra and sent him plunging into the ground, unleashing another sizable explosion onto the already blackened and ash-covered rocky wasteland. The rising mushroom cloud of debris and smoke had yet to dissolve, though it no longer radiated with a fiery burn. Still hanging upside down in midair, Ichigo sent out a pulse of power to scan the wildly fluctuating energies within the vicinity. And just in time too. He barely managed to twist Zangetsu behind him as he heard the crash of Hunt's steel. Your senses have become sharper, Ichigo-kun. Ichigo snorted as he turned around and slashed with the white blade. Didn't really have much of a choice. I was getting sick and tired of you cutting me up everywhere. It was a rather remarkable experience for Ichigo. He and Sanji continued to trade blows, and all the while, he was still hanging upside down. Amid sparks flying, he could feel a grin slowly carve its way onto his lips. What? You're slowing down, Sanji. Age catching up to you? A second later, gleaming steel managed to cut a shallow line across the bridge of his nose. Not quite, the Shinsengumi captain grinned. Well then. Ichigo answered Sanji with a challenging smile of his own. Simultaneously, the two disappeared and begun their lethal dance at supersonic speeds. Flies. Swarm in a Buon-like. And once more, Sutra interrupted their swords and crashed in between them. Ichigo briefly took his eyes off and did a once-over on the giant. Sutra was bleeding from his head and had a sizable gash across his right shoulder. However, Ichigo was well aware that those wounds might as well have been nothing more than paper cuts for the strongest rook in the underworld. Sanji, on the other, was entirely wound-free. Sure, his clothes were cut in a few places and dirtied with ash, but aside from that, the samurai came scot-free from their practice session. Ichigo couldn't help but admire the smiling swordsman. In terms of power and ability, Ichigo beat out Sanji. Nevertheless, the samurai possessed a level of swordplay and technique that Ichigo could only dream of. Sanji could carve out your organs before you could even notice him draw his sword. Perhaps, Sanji mused as he angled his blade, we should, how do you say, kick things up a notch. For the practice if anything. Alright by me, Ichigo said as he stood straighter and bumped Zangetsu against his shoulder. Sutra, for his part, bellowed out a deep laugh. How about a bet, lads? Oh? Sanji raised a curious brow. What do you have in mind? Ichigo flicked his eyes towards the madly grinning giant. Hers to touch the ground has to buy dinner. Ichigo frowned. Sorry, I already promised Tiamat dinner, so pass on that one. Sutra spit out a glob of molten liquid. The dragons whipped you good, lad. Who's the master and who's the servant, eh? A proper man would have given her real handlin'. Ichigo gave him an unimpressed stare. I'd like to see you say that to her face. Sanji barked out a laugh. Oh, I would love to see that as well. 'Twill be well worth the property damage to see the old one put you in your place. The giant let out a low growl. HMPH. No bloody dragon would get the best of me. Really? Ichigo smirked. That's not what I heard. Last I checked, you somehow managed to piss off Midgardsormr and he ripped you through a whole mountain range. Sutra swiped the air before him in denial. The damnable snake blindsided me. Whatever. Ichigo twirled the white blade in his hands and brought out the full force of his demonic power. The underworld slowly began to lose color under the burning force of his aura. Let's put an end to this. At least I got a woman waiting for me, unlike you two baboons. Sanji's eyes narrowed dangerously, his own impressive demonic power leaking out and pressing against Ichigo's. And how would you know that, my young Kohai? Because you've got a fetish for long, hard and pointy and well, as for big, loud and orange you really have to ask. Traitor. Heathen. Sutra roared to the sky. You two are orange. And don't I look good with it? Sutra and Sanji glowered at him as their combined energy pressed and warred with his own significant aura. At the center of the space among the three of them, a point of lightning began to arc and surge across the ground and sky, hacking though cloud and stone in wild and erratic lines. Slabs of rock began burst apart as the currents of power ran wild through the underworld and turned solid earth into bits of debris and dust. All three of the peerage members had their eyes turn a searing red as a furious whirl of demonic essence gathered in dense and thick vapors. And just as soon as they were ready to lunge against one another, a sudden voice cut through the monstrous tension. Well, aren't we all having fun? I'm hurt you didn't invite me out to play. All three of them exchanged a look before turning their gaze to the side, though they kept their respective power climbing and surged. What are you doing here, Surziches? Ichigo asked as he glanced at their king from the corner of his eyes. Aren't the pillars in session currently? Shouldn't you be finalizing the budget for the coming fiscal year? Details. Surziches waved him off before folding his arms behind his back. Now I need something from you boys. See, Ajuka and I have a little excursion that requires our direct attention. While we do that, I need you all to run interference with Grafia for us. What do you think we are? Suicidal Ichigo stared up incredulously at the gentle smile of Surzich's. To the fucking pits with ya, you crazy loon of a master. Like hell, I'm gonna go off and fucking jump in that shit and fire. Sanji nodded his head in agreement. My apologies, my liege. However, I will have to go along with my compatriots. It's too early to die just yet. Surzich's smile slowly dimmed. Well, now that's troubling. Unfortunately, and those sea green eyes burned with the fury of a Satan, I'm not asking you. I'm ordering you. Ichigo exchanged a glance with Sutra and Sanji. All three of them nodded in tandem and sprang at the floating king. Idiots, she hissed under her breath. The entire underworld had been rocking for several hours as three ultimate-class devils frantically clashed against one another without any restraint. And to make matters worse, a Satan joined them halfway through the nonsensical rumble. Currently, situated in one of the manor's many sitting rooms, Grafia was carefully bandaging the three heavily wounded devils. Sutra, Sanji and Surzich's all were bleeding from various places and covered in bruises. All of them had at least 3 broken ribs and one of their appendages fractured in numerous places. Ichigo was looking no better as he was covered in soot and had a hand swollen to ridiculous proportion in a purplish and black mass. However, the young devil didn't need her to attend to him. He merely sat cross-legged, circulating his demonic power and expelled all foreign energy from his body. His ridiculous healing factor would see him back to 100% within 24 hours. The others 3 would require at least 3 times that length of time to fully recuperate from their numerous injuries. Honestly, she was left amazed by Ichigo's regenerative abilities at times. While they weren't up to par with the Phoenix clans, nor the mythical bird from which they derived their powers, it was nothing to scoff at. While she had experimented with the young man on the full scope of his abilities, they still hadn't managed to gain a full understanding of how much he could regenerate. Ow. Surzich's flinched as she disinfected the wound on his brow. A little gentler, dear, he frowned. She jabbed the cotton ball onto the broken skin. Ow. I can't believe how ridiculous all 4 of you have been, she muttered angrily. Do you have any idea how much damage you've caused? Ah, lay off will ya, sis. Sutra grumbled from where he lay immobile on the couch. 'Twas good fun, Sol. She picked up the nearest thing, which happened to be a lamp, and threw it at his head before returning her attention to her tearful husband. Uff. Damn it all. That fucking hurt. Good, now shut up before I give you something to really bemoan about. She noticed that Sanji was tactfully staying silent, though the soft smile playing across his lips caused her brow to crease in a minor frown. Really now Grafia, it wasn't that bad, Surzicha said as his eyes winced in another bout of momentary pain. Her hand stopped from placing the bandage and she fixed him with a frigid glare. He immediately averted her gaze. Not that bad, she grit out. You brick for brains Neanderthals destroyed more than 19 square miles of property in the span of 4 hours. Do you have any idea what sort of damage you've brought about? Actually I kind of do, Surzicha smiled up at her sheepishly. Her glare intensified and she twisted his ear. Ow. Grafia, I'm sorry. Look Ow. I'll fix it, just let Ow go. This is no laughing matter Surzich's. Already the servants have reported several strange creatures coming out from underground, attracted to the dense layers of demonic power floating in the area. If nothing is done quickly, we'll have to deal with a swarm of mutants again. Right, Surzich's massaged his ear with one hand, that was a particular nasty autumn. Mutants. She turned around, keeping the twitch of amusement off her lips. Ever the inquisitive one, Ichigo had broken his silent meditation in lieu of giving in to his curiosity. Despite her current sour attitude towards his actions, she couldn't help but approve of his willingness to always learn. When it swirls particularly dense and gathers at long periods of time, she immediately switched into lecturing mode. Demonic power can have adverse effects on the area it is coalesced. Flora and fauna tend to mutate, weather patterns shift abruptly, and all sorts of magical phenomena incline to occur. It's the reason for the underworld's astonishingly variant wildlife. Thousands of years of potent demonic armies marching across its surface and leaking magic left and right, the underworld's naturally superior environment was further supersaturated by its more powerful inhabitants. Ichigo craned his head up to the side in thought. Who would have guessed? To each their own applies to even different worlds. Such are the precepts of creation, little one. Immediately, the air in the sitting room shifted and with it, its mood. Tiamat strode in, as stunning as ever. Grafia had to admit, most women in the supernatural had an appearance that would leave the average human woman in despair, yet Tiamat was to the supernatural what they were to humans. And even then, there was an exclusivity to Tiamat's splendor. It wasn't something of incredible radiance or impossibility. It's something natural yet also unearthly. Even as a member of the same gender, one who was married and had a child, Grafia could not deny there was an attraction to those lovely and enticing lips. Ichigo breathlessly rose to his feet, his face struck in stunned thought. Tiamat addressed herself in a traditional Indian sari of dark blue. Silver-trimmed edges reflected specks of light breaking through the heavy drapes covering the windows of the sitting room. Graffia's eyes briefly drifted to Ichigo and the corners of her mouth turned up. The poor boy never stood a chance. She cautiously tracked the ancient dragon's every move, however, Tiamat had eyes only for the youngest among them and easily ignored everyone else. Do you not recall, little master? I have said before, every crook of the cosmos abides by its own mandate. What is order here may be chaos there. That held in anathema may be viewed as innate. Tiamat stopped right before her young charge, and Graphia was torn on whether to intervene or to leave Ichigo to the primordial's tender, non-existent, mercies. Always does creation move. Tiamat pressed the flat of both hands onto Ichigo's chest and stepped in close. Almost instinctively, the young devil wrapped his arms around her waist. Changing and shifting like the very oceans. No rhyme. She shifted in his arms, nudging his chin over her shoulder and letting her breath fall over his cheek as she nuzzled her nose against him. Never a reason. That poor boy. Graphia managed to regain enough of her senses to turn away from the flirting couple and back to her husband. Unfortunately, Surzich's eyes were firmly glued to Tiamat and not her face. Sanji at least had his eyes narrowed in caution, but nonetheless, there was the obvious color of desire in them. As for Sutra, well, that particular idiot was openly drooling. The queen of the manor rolled her eyes in exasperation. Men. Amusement flicked through her eyes though she made sure to keep it off of her expression. The eons passed, yet the other sex has evolved with the efficiency of a rock. The very same methods she used on Abzu tens of thousands of years ago were just as effective on Ichigo today. Though in fairness, her little master was significantly younger than her deceased husband and, in no way, did he possess even a hint of the same wisdom. The spot between her shoulder and neck, that soft flesh was delicately washed with his warm breath. The single place of heat caused the rest of her body to break down in an involuntary shiver. Each world is different. Slowly, she slid her hands down her own body until they overlapped his, and each world sits with different layers of power. Thus each realm progresses with its own laws. Her fingers pried his open and she stepped out of his embrace, making sure to place extra emphasis on the sway of her hips. She did not need eyes on the back of her head to know where his gaze was centered. Young and virile, it would be a matter of concern if he wasn't looking there. He was no saint. Not by mind and certainly not by body. However, what you must realize is that despite the variance and laws of each world, you are ever bound by what is native to you so long as your nature does not change, then your understanding remains unchanged too. She approached the door and slowly pushed the door open and took a single step forward. The entire corridor lay before her, void of person but rich with adornment. Tiamat placed a single hand on the frame of the door and barely tilted her head so that she appeared to be looking over her arm. Well, did you not promise dinner? There was a moment of silence before he jumbled through his words and swiftly came to her side. In a mere matter of minutes, he had led her to a small secluded area. A single lone table sat, made of dark wood and holding utensils of cuisine. Oh? You've put some thought into this, then? A light of mirth danced through her eyes. With amusement, she realized that, perhaps, he really was concerned that she would devour the little fox. Well, she wasn't about to complain if his misconception garnered her preferential treatment. He quickly sidestepped around her and pulled out the chair for her. Tiamat regarded him for a minute, eyes mired in confusion as to why he would do something she could easily have managed on her own. With little effort, she pulled his intentions from his mind and what she found made her smile. Thank you, she said softly. He nodded his head silently. A soft laugh echoed in her mind. He had managed to regain his bearings and overcame the stupor she had ingrained in him initially. Tiamat wondered if he even realized how quickly he was changing. When they first met with one another, he couldn't keep his eyes off her body. Now, he could tear his eyes away after only a bare minute of entrancement. Slowly, day by day, the darkness in him was growing. Eclipsing what was left of his humanity and leaving him a shadowed flame, burning with purpose and stalwart resolve. And, most favorable for her, every moment saw the two of them bond deeper and deeper. As she sat, he pushed her in, and she suddenly remembered something she had picked off from one of the magazines given to her by one of the servant girls. There had been a written piece titled 101 Ways to Please Your Man. Tiamat had laughed at that. As if men were so complicated that there needed to be so many ways to please them. All woman needed to make the simple creature known as man happy was a kitchen and a bed. Everything else in life was for the luxury and pleasure of the woman. Do you like manticore? Pardon? She broke from her thoughts and gazed at him curiously. Manticore? The main course is manticore steak. I tried looking through your memories to see what you preferred but well, there were too many to sift through. She offered with a teasing smile. Yeah, sorry. It's quite alright. She dipped her head in acceptance as a servant came forward and filled their respective glasses with a dark violet liquid. It would be surprising instead if you did not lose your way in my mind. There are far too many memories for you search through on your own. If you have any curiosity, simply ask. I will guide you through them myself. She took a sip from her drink, finding a splash of fruity flavor wadded with the soft aroma of alcohol. As to your question, yes, I enjoy manticore meat. In a moment of mischief, she sent him a mental image. One of a maned neck being clearly snapped audibly, of fur being singed and cleared by fire, and of a sapphire muzzle caked in gore as it gorged on a bloody carcass. His stare fell flat and annoyed. Thank you. No, I mean it. I'll so very much enjoy the imagery as I eat. She laughed quietly. In truth, she was actually quite excited as to what the meal would be like. Generally speaking, she did not cook her food. She was far too used to outright killing her prey and devouring their flesh raw. Albeit, on rare occasion she did crave what was considered cuisine and ventured into civilization for a meal. However, she preferred her usual methods of gathering food. A decent hour passed, where they ate in silence while their minds touched consistently. Every few seconds, they would share a sensation or flavor they had found to their liking. At times, even conjuring up past meals that felt similar to the taste. It was pleasant. More so, truth be told. It was the most delight she had partaken in for the last several centuries. And upon that thought, Tiamat began to fully appreciate just how much the familiar bond had begun to affect her. Did she have lovers in the past? Of course. There had been both men and women whose company she had kept over the eons. Sometimes, she had shared a bed with them for centuries at a time. Yet, she had never done what she had done with him with others. She had bonded with him. It was a gamble and a terrible one at that. She had bonded with Abzu and over the millennia, she had become one with him. His death had driven her to insanity. A soulful tear that left her with only cold madness. It was only the touch of the dream that mended her flayed soul. So why did she risk it all again? Do you believe in destiny, little one? They had left the table after finishing their meal and were calmly walking down the corridor to the bedroom. Side by side, the back of their hands brushed in consistence until he finally decided to softly grip hers. The edges of her mouth lifted. Destiny? His forehead furrowed. In a way, yeah, I do. She blinked in surprise. Honestly, she was expecting him to reply in the negative. You believe there is a set of predetermined events that guide you then? How to explain it? He raised his free hand and scratched the back of his head. There's a reason for everything. I don't believe in wild chance. But, I don't believe that I should concern myself with things that don't give me anything aside from a headache. I'll make my decisions and choices, and if someone else wants to take credit, kudos on that. He opened the doorway to bedroom and she stepped in first, letting go of his hand. Immediately, she made her way to the bed while he headed for his dresser. He took off his shirt, or what remained of the ash-covered garment, grabbed fresh clothes and headed into the conjoined bathroom. The ebbs and flow of fate did exist. Forged and made by the countless choices of all life. The elder vision allowed her to peer into its chaotic currents, and, often, she moved across the world according to what she understood. She heard the rush of water as he stepped into the shower. The young devil known as Ichigo was a shatterpoint for the earth and the several worlds most closely connected to it. Most importantly, his shatterpoint was directly overlapped with hers. Just as she and Abzu had been tied together, the moment she had seen his tiny body from high in the Tempest Squall on that day not so long ago, she beheld the same cracks and webbing forming again. The moment she saw him, Tiamat of Mesopotamia knew. He was hers. And she was his. Her future, the one that was most significant and essential in the ever-changing lines of time, was with him. Gingerly, she fell backwards onto the bed, the mattress quietly heaving under her weight. Her hair sprayed wildly around like a white sun, she absently tracked her eyes across the stone ceiling. 7,000 years had passed since Abzu was murdered. 7,000 years of forgetting, regretting and deserting. Yet, never once did she forsake those fathomless black eyes, lined with a night blue ring. She let out a breath, filling the air with a sea salt scent. Solemnly, she spoke out to the figure in her memories. Well beloved. A home once more. Serzicha sat in his personal viewing box, high up in the arena of the rating games. With 2 fingers pressed to smiling lips and eyes lightly closed, he effortlessly cleared his mind. Grafia, he called, opening his eyes and allowing the smile to fall away. Yes, my king. Her tone professional, curt, and just a tad bit acerbic. He held back the laugh bubbling in his chest. His wife was still upset to the roughhousing he had gotten up to with his boys a few days back. Had she known that the whole thing had been planned by him from the beginning, she would be even more furious. Never mind why he had staged that little war. My dear, can you tell me what happened to my other throne? He shifted uncomfortably. The one I had tailor-made last summer. Not this piss-poor excuse of a carved rock. Silver eyes blinked once before coolly turning away. I'm quite sure I have no idea, my king. He let out a leaden breath and gave her an annoyed look. Don't you think you're taking this too far, Grafia? She didn't deign to answer him. Really, what a troublesome wife I have. There was a soft knock from behind him. Enter. My lord, a soft female voice spoke. One of the many maids at his beck and call. His Highness, the great king is asking for an audience. Shall I I'm not asking for anything, you miserable wretch. Much less from my own flesh and blood. The familiar scent of oblivion drifted into the room and Serzich's couldn't help but close in his eyes in a silent sigh. He waved a hand and an identical throne to his appeared beside him. "Grandfather," he said with obvious fake jubilance, "how nice to see you. Please, have a seat. Your impudence ever grows." Serzich's. From the corner of his eyes, he saw a dark cloak swish onto the floor and the throne neatly occupied. "Your father wouldn't have remained seated while greeting me. Father is a rare breed of devil, you and I know both that. We also know that power comes before age and beauty. So if you wish for me to get up you're free to try and make me. You're your mother's son through and through. And, by extension, yours." Serzich's knew all too well that the old man would never let go of an opportunity to compliment his cherished bloodline. He didn't receive an answer so he turned towards Grafia. "Bring me a bottle of the moon wine, the one from my personal collection." Grafia said nothing, merely bowing at the waist and sinking into the floor through a magic circle. "I still can't believe you married a Lucifuge," the devil next to him muttered. Serzich's slowly turned in his seat. Zekrom Bale was the central figure amongst the 72 pillars and the main reason why so many had flocked to his banner during the Underworld Civil War. His ancestor had decided that the Underworld was better ruled in the hands of himself than with the crazed descendants of the original four. While the four ruled the entirety of the population of devils, reincarnated or otherwise, most of the nobility were in the Great King's pocket. For his part, the old devil had softly combed back hair of stark and clean white. His beard was half a fist in length and equally neat in its trim. "Of what assistance can I provide you, grandfather? I want what the bloody hell happened to your eyebrows, boy?" Immediately, Serzich's mind fell sour. Sutra had, in the most annoying fashion, managed to singe off both eyebrows. And, for one infuriating reason or another, they refused to grow back. The Norse giant was currently sent off on a wild goose chase to scout a possible old regime base in Antarctica. Before he could respond, Zekrom quickly cut off any explanation he could offer. "Well, never mind. I'm sure it was your own usual brand of idiocy." He held back the urge to roll his eyes. His ancestor was bluntly rude to the point where even his youngest charge would be left openly gaping. The worst part was, the old devil demanded the utmost etiquette and respect from others. Bloody hypocrite. To the point, "I wish to purchase the load of lucent you recently gathered." Serzich's blinked in surprise. He didn't think that Zekrom had already found about that so soon. "Come now boy, don't be an idiot." The Great King gave him a dry stare. "All the underworld felt you and your servants clash like lunatics. My spies reported that Ajuka's people arrived but a day later and gathered all the remnant demonic energy. What other purpose would the two of you have but to crystallize all that demonic power and create lucent from it? Now name your price." He wasn't surprised that Zekrom had spies. That was a problem he had been dealing with for centuries, but it was one he was able to manage. What did bother him was that he was able to recognize Ajuka's people so easily. Not even 2 days had passed since the battle with his peerage, and Zekrom had already uncovered their identities. Ajuka went to great lengths to keep his researchers' identities anonymous, after all. "I'm sorry grandfather," Serzicha said solemnly, "but that batch of lucent is being put to use even as we speak." "Ridiculous," the old devil immediately scoffed. "There must have been enough energy there to fuel New Lilith for weeks. I know for a fact that neither you nor Ajuka are currently funding any projects on that large of a scale. And I also would have known if you attempted to ship so much lucent out of the underworld. Well, it's a very recent work of ours." A light smile began to play across his lips. "Admittedly, it's my scheme, but I did drag the others into it." Grafia reappeared at that time. Instantly, she waved a hand and a small table appeared between the twin thrones, along with 2 goblets. As she poured a generous measure in each glass, Zekrom harumphed. "So all 4 of you are involved in this. Well, I suppose it's only a matter of time before I discover what." "Oh, you should find out very soon." Both his wife and ancestor shot him a wary glance, though he paid them no mind. As Grafia placed the bottle down, between them, Serzich's looked at her with a smile. "Grafia, darling, do begin the game. I believe a sufficient audience has gathered." Zekrom swirled the liquid and wafted it towards his nose. "What a unique scent for moon wine. Exactly what vineyard is this?" Grafia's voice began to boom through the arena, announcing the rules and participants of the engagement, and Serzich's used the opportunity to reach out mentally to Ajuka. "Everything is prepared." Naturally, even Ajuka's mental voice sounded bored. "You need but give the signal." "Oh, this." He gestured with one hand while taking a sip of the rich flavor and returning his attention to Zekrom. "It's the last harvest of the Temple of Artemis before its final destruction. As far as I know, the last 6 jugs in existence are in my possession." "What?" Zekrom practically shot out of chair. "You scoundrel. I've spent the last 2,000 years looking for one and you've had 6 of them this whole time. Where did you get them?" "Actually, I had 12 initially." Zekrom gave a choked noise. I won them in a game of dice from a genie I met in Africa. Of all the rotten luck, the old devil mumbled from beside him. As Grafy announced the participants while they entered, Surziches contacted Ichigo. Remember Ichigo, Big Bang from the beginning. Yeah. Just hurry up and start this already. I promised to take Yusaka out on a date. Surziches chuckled. To be young and in love. So that is the boy that has garnered so much attention recently, Zekrom spoke with a frown in his voice. Yes, that's him, he replied with a curved smile. And yes, he's every bit the threat that you believe him to be. Then why keep him alive? The frown growing more pronounced. Because I like him. Grafia gave the signal to start and not even a second later, the entire dimensional space of the arena exploded in a miniature sun. Even seated far away and safely behind numerous layers of magical protection, the VIP box shook under the sheer force of the eruption of hellfire. What the deuce? Zekrom shot to his feet. Grafia's surprised voice hesitantly announced the results of Ichigo's release of his full power. Duke Barbados and his entire peerage have been eliminated, winner pawn of Lucifer, Baron Ichigo Kurosaki. Grafia's voice shook as if she could hardly believe the sheer barbarity of the overwhelming display of power Ichigo had uncharacteristically displayed. No one could even see anything. All that was visible was a monstrous world of hellfire which churned in on itself, like multiple tsunami ready to crash down onto an unsuspecting shore. Surziches stood from his throne and tapped the dark power that lay deep within him. Not the power of destruction which was inherent to his being. But the other source, the one which he had taken along with the crown of sovereignty of all devils. His presence climbed and with it his aura flared within the underworld. His wasn't the only one, though. In each cardinal positions, all four Satans unleashed the brunt of their might. Surziches. The uncertainty and fear was plain in Grafia's eyes, but he paid it no heed. It was all too rare, after all, when he was allowed to divulge and indulge his inner nature. Zekrom growled with a seething rage from behind. This is what you're using the Lucent for, fueling a black sacrament. Not just any black sacrament. The sacrament. Awaken. The sky shook and dark lines appeared in the flames, linking and lining into a complex series of formulae and magical formations. Somewhere, someone screamed. Several someones. Agony and misery drew forth in a mass of black clouds that swallowed the raging inferno which Ichigo had summoned. Break. You've gone mad, Surziches, Zekrom roared. He's just a child. He won't be able to bear it. Again, the sky boomed and his connection with the underworld let him know that monstrous tremors were rocking New Lilith and everything within its vicinity. There would be deaths from this ritual, but it was a small price to pay for the delightful consequences. Bind. You'll kill us all. And at once, in a second's breath, the black ink-like shadow shrunk into a single point. A pinprick of eldritch darkness so intense it began to devour all the light and leave behind a staunch and grey world. Malice churned through the very air, choking those too weak to stand its corrosive presence as it repped and roared. Anger and rage stand supreme. With power and flame does the world bear injury against the wrong. Enlightened sin chokes the deceit of truth and innocence. Rupture and chain burn. That single point, pulling in all towards it like an engine of gravity, slowly began to grow and morph in shape. As if something were inside and trying to get out, it bulged in directions and stretched long. Carefully, it settled to stillness in a dark sphere pulsating with a faint red glow. In one fluid motion it cracked apart, revealing a humanoid standing static and with a mirage of heat dancing about. Armor of black and dull plates ran across the torso and spine, filled with red veins of fire and smoldering ash. A flat, skull-plated helm with two horns protruded forward and welded into a twisted crown of spired and black steel. A crimson glow in those empty sockets matched the mane of vermilion hair launching down the back. Fingers, clawed and clad in black mail, slowly stretched, allowing molten liquid and fire fall from the palms and eat away at the ground. A wrist moved, and the entire night sky shifted as it gathered in both hands. Creeping into the form of two long and thin ebony blades, churning and wailing with the souls of the damned. Life taken anew, sin blackened once more, step forward, Crown Prince Wrath. Chapter 16. It begins anew. Yusaka gave a soft moan as sunlight wafted through the curtains and dappled across her sleep-leaden face. A tremendous ache swept through her temples, the light of the sun not helping in the least. She rubbed her legs against one another under the cool silken sheets and wriggled her body for comfort. Yet, when her butt brushed against a solid wall of warmth, her eyes flitted open immediately. Firm arms around her waist tightened and she felt a gentle kiss land on her bare shoulder. She let low a soft laugh. Closing her eyes, she smiled sleepily into her pillow. Morning, Yusaka. She gave another groggy groan through the pain in her head and turned in her husband's arms, burying her face into his chest. Good morning, Ichigo. Rest well, he asked, this time kissing the crown of her head. I would have, she nuzzled deeper into him, if someone hadn't kept me up well into the night. One hand slid up from the small of her back and started a slow massage on her neck. You can't honestly blame me for last night. She nipped playfully at his skin with her teeth. Yes, I can. What time is it, anyways? A little more than 8:15. Her eyes flew open, dispelled of any trace of sleep. She craned her neck up at him in alarm. What? You can't be serious. He looked down at her with his infuriating impassiveness and cocked an eyebrow. Quite. Not that it matters. Not that it matters, she pushed away from him in a furious rush. Ichigo's callous disregard towards her numerous responsibilities had long since grated on her nerves. She sat up in a rush, which caused a sudden spell of dizziness to overtake her. Gripping her head and placing a steadying hand on the bed, she let out another groan. Damn it all. With a sluggish slow, she began to fumble with the bed sheets and wrap them around herself as she slid out of bed. Eyes sweeping about for any article of clothing in reachable distance, she could only find, much to her aggravation, were torn remnants from last night's passion. For all the bemoaning Ichigo did in regards to having to replace his apparel, he had no qualms ruining other people's. Why didn't any of the maids come and wake me? They know I'm supposed to be up by 7, she muttered angrily, while simultaneously circulating her chakra to rid herself of the soreness from last night's sex, as well as the killer headache surging through the forefronts of her mind. Probably because they were ordered not to. Her long hair whipped about, big mistake because the full force of her headache protested like a rampaging dragon as she turned towards him in a mire of shock and outrage. What? Why would you do that? Brushing his bangs out of his eyes, her husband propped himself up against the headboard. A certain look played off his face, suggesting that she had asked something which was a little too obvious. Nothing wrong with a husband and wife wanting to spend their morning together alone. Isaka balled her hands, finger by finger, into the fabric against her chest and fixed him with the coldest glare she could muster. Which was quite impressive considering her 400 years in court politics. Past the indignant frustration swirling in her throat, she ground out her words in a slow and controlled fashion. I understand. Believe me when I say I understand. I want nothing more than to spend every waking morning lying in your arms until half the day has wasted away. I want nothing more than to spend all of my time with you and our daughter. But I can't, Ichigo. I can't. But he didn't say anything. When he persisted on looking at her with that uncaring and neutral expression of his, she continued with a hint of venom in her voice. I'm not you, Ichigo. I can't just leave my country and do whatever I please when I want. It may be fine because you rule over a territory that is utterly subservient to you out of sheer fear and terror, but I have people that depend on me. I have millions of lives to look after. And I don't appreciate it when you decide to just interfere and make decisions on behalf of me. They rarely argued with actual bite to their words, and Yusaka felt terrible that their morning was starting out this way, but she needed to put her foot down. Well, that and she felt terrible in general due to the, now slightly receding, headache. Ichigo had to understand that, as empress to her country, Yusaka's responsibilities superseded her personal matters. It was the one aspect of her life she hated most. The fact that her daughter was forced to give up so much of normalcy, at least what passed for normalcy in the supernatural, and live the life demanded of royalty. The fact that she couldn't simply saunter off into the world with the man she loved. Ichigo nodded to himself with a defeated expression. You're right. I have no right to interfere in these aspects of your life. Isaka felt a swell of guilt and disappointment as he got out of bed, grabbed his jeans and slid them on. Her expression softened a smidgen, though she held her ground. I'm sorry, love. I didn't mean to ruin our morning like this, but please understand where I'm coming from. He sent her a smile, and Yusaka felt relief pour through her as his brown eyes filled with a level of softness. He crossed the distance between them with his lengthy strides and quickly wrapped her in an embrace. Stepping forward into his arms, she let out a soft whisper of, I love you. He whispered his affections back and, as he pulled back from her, Yusaka felt the air cool as his warmth left her completely. A sense of displeasure twisted inside, and it only grew more considerable as he snapped his fingers and conjured a rift that led into the underworld. You're leaving. The disappointment in her voice was all too evident, though he didn't seem to notice it as he raised his arms and nonchalantly stretched the muscles in his back. Yeah, I just remembered there are a few things I need to take care of before I start my long-deserved vacation. Wondering what those things were, the sudden sound of wicked laughter and the image of serpentine blue eyes flashed through her mind. Perfectly white teeth bit hard onto her lower lips. Please don't be mad at me. Please don't go to her. He blinked once in confusion before an undecipherable smile curved across his lips. Avoiding his eyes, Yusaka dropped her gaze and stared hard at the floor. Honestly afraid that she had earned his temper and driven him away. Despite being the crown prince of wrath, Ichigo had a long fuse to burn through. But once it reached its end, there would be hell to pay. Literally. However, in that moment, Ichigo's feet entered her line of sight and she felt a warm press on both of her cheeks. He carefully lifted her gaze until her eyes unwantingly met with his. Swiftly, his lips captured hers and the next thing Yusaka knew, she was moving her mouth against his as a searing fire crept down her throat and filled the entirety of her insides. Clutching the bed sheets to her chest with one hand, she wrapped the other around his neck, fingering locks of his hair roughly. His natural heat radiated off of him and touched right through the fabric. His hands fell away from her face and set to roaming over her body. When she felt one of them fall onto her ass and give a firm squeeze, she moaned into his mouth. Morning arousal renewed, she set her tongue to lounge over his in a sense of vigor and passion. He kissed back with even fiercer intensity, and Yusaka could slowly feel the haze of desire creep over and rob coherence from her thoughts. She gasped out loud as Ichigo fisted a hand in her hair and pulled her head back, attacking her throat in a furious rush of kisses and soft bites. Ichigo, she managed to rasp out. We need tea on. Ichigo. Sorry, he said as he let out a dark chuckle and pulled away. His arms were loke steel as they caged around her and pulled her close to his chest, rocking her gently in a light sway. I didn't mean to take it that far. Head tucked beneath his chin, Yusaka could feel a blush as it heated its way through her cheeks. Slightly breathless and, perhaps, just a tad bit weak in the legs, she allowed herself to lean against him and use him for support. The coldness settled around her as he suddenly pulled away, robbing her of his heat, though not before he planted one last kiss on her brow. See you in a few days, he said, and turned towards the gaping void. However, just as he was about to set foot in the tier in space, he suddenly snapped his fingers and cried out as if something came to him. Dropping a fist into a hand, he turned around with a smile that instantly put her on edge. She knew that smile. She knew it all too well. It was the same one that glinted with enough mischief to put their impish and troublemaking daughter to shame. I almost forgot. She instinctively took a cautionary step back. You almost forgot what? She asked warily. The corner of his mouth practically carved itself into smile, and he clapped twice. The bedroom door slipped open and immediately a neatly dressed maid entered. Isaka let out a shriek and practically teleported to behind her husband, clutching the bedsheets for dear life. "Deed," she yelled at the suddenly startled maid. "Get out. Out." The poor girl who she just screamed at gave a soft cry of her own and quickly backpedaled out of the room. "I'm so sorry, Yusaka-hime. I had no idea. Please forgive me. Wait a sec, there was reason I called you here. Regardless of our state of dress. Ichigo," she hissed out, "what are you doing?" "Trust me," he said, before beckoning the young girl back into the room with a hand gesture. Casting a suspicious glance towards him, she put herself on the tips of her toes and draped herself over his broad and admittedly very sexy shoulders. Deed, was it? And her suspicion only grew by several magnitudes when Ichigo flashed the girl a deep and highly uncustomary smile. The young girl gave Ichigo a once-over glance. Disheveled and wild hair straight out of bed. Utterly topless, revealing toned and hard muscles covered with the grime of a night's worth of passion and sex. And his presence finalized with low-slung jeans that revealed the enticing V right above his groin. The teenage Imkai girl never stood a chance. Noticing her blush crimson to the roots of her hair, Yusaka sent the maid a withering glare which would have frozen a meteor in its place. Was she jealously possessive? Incredibly so. Did she feel any guilt in marking her territory by shamelessly allowing her hands to roam over Ichigo's chest? Not in the least. It was bad enough she had to deal with a stupid overgrown lizard in the underworld, but dissension in her own palace. Not in this lifetime. Can you answer a few questions for me? Ichigo's voice broke her out of her thoughts, and she saw the girl tentatively shake her head up and down. Tell me, his voice dropped to that low husk that often foretold the devil in him had come out to play. Were you ordered to not wake up my wife this morning? Isaka sent a quick frown his way before returning her attention to the maid. What was he getting at? As the girl gave another hesitant nod, Ichigo's lips became dangerously curved. Can you tell me who gave the order? Why was Ichigo asking something so asinine? They had already established that it was on his orders that the maids did not wake her at her customary hour and caused her to be late in starting her daily routine. Infuriatingly enough, the maid dropped her eyes to the floor and let out mumbles so soft that she couldn't pick it up even with her enhanced hearing. I'm sorry, could you repeat that? Ichigo smiled the devil's smile. Isaka-hime ordered us not to, she squeaked out. Isaka's mouth parted and her eyes went wide in a considerable fashion. Oh. What else did she command? The sheer level of predator in his purr caused iced water to pool into her spine. The maid hardly fared any better. Her ladyship commanded that her entire schedule for tomorrow be thrown out and that will be all, he swiftly cut her off. You may leave. The girl did not need to be told twice and bolted from the room and shut the door tight behind her, leaving Yusaka absolutely no room for escape. Except for the swirling vortex of demonic energies which would deftly deposit her in the middle of Ichigo's underworld territory. Obviously not a choice. He never said a word, but Yusaka slowly slid her arms away from his neck and came off of his back. Gripping the sheets no longer clenched between their bodies, Yusaka opened her mouth but promptly shut it. He turned around with an unreadable expression touched with slightest spice of amusement. Carefully, Ichigo lifted a single golden tress off of her shoulder and began to play with it betwixt the fingers of one hand. If, and he began in the most patronizing tone possible, Her Enlightened Highness would deign to recall. Their cheeks went crimson with a searing and mortified rush of blood. The Lady Asaka, Empress of the mystical realms of Nihon, Keeper of the Eddies of Kyoto and High Priestess to Her Illustrious Holiness Amaterasu, it was she who, in a fit of childish tantrum, had a substantial intake of alcohol as a means of venting her aggravation. After which, she proceeded to, and rather unceremoniously might I add, throw out any and all visitors she had, declare to the entire world on the subject of what an ass her husband is. She desperately set her mind to remember the events of last night, but all that came up was a blank headache. And then, she progressed to dragging said ass of a husband to her bedroom, tore off all of her clothes, proclaimed, and I quote, "I want you in." Asaka immediately covered Ichigo's mouth with both hands and fixed him with a humiliated and pleading expression. I'm so screwed. No wonder she had woken up with a head-splitting ache. She had drunk herself into a stupor last night in a rare moment of weakness and in front of so many servants at that too. She closed her eyes in frustration. The sheer humiliation. And what was worse, the consequences of last night's actions. She had taken those frustrations out on her husband and completely blamed him in a horrible moment of misunderstanding. Her eyes tore open and fixed themselves on the perfectly sculpted chest of her husband. He had perfectly smooth skin, except for 2 fist-sized scars that ran over the left side of his chest. The cluster of dread clumped her throat. She recognized that the portal to the underworld had closed behind her, yet the demonic energy within their bedroom had not receded. If anything, it only climbed further and further. A moment later, she remembered her hands were still covering Ichigo's mouth, however, she couldn't quite muster the strength necessary to remove them from where they were. Her gaze followed her bare arms to the face they were touching, and a cold shiver passed through her. He normally kept his face impassive and unreadable, but to those who truly knew him, they understood that Ichigo's mood was often reflected in his eyes. And, as of now, those eyes were red-rimmed sulfuric yellow, deeply immersed and dyed in demonic energy. Wrath was his sin, and he was damn good at getting even with people. She swallowed that clump of dread in her throat, only to have it settle in the pit of her stomach and infect the rest of her body. Her hands moved from his mouth as she tried to muster all the courage she could. It really wasn't all much, regrettably. And now, Ichigo. I realized that I was a tad bit unfair. He took a single step forward and Yusaka immediately took 1 step back. Ichigo, wait. We can discuss this. He took another step and, this time, she took several back. With the rush of a vengeful husband clouding her mind, she irrationally bemoaned how it wasn't fair that his stride was practically double hers. 1 more step and Yusaka ran out of room and tripped back down onto her bed. He was like a bird of prey, swooping down on her in that moment of surprise, and she couldn't help but cry out in shock. However, that cry of hers was quickly silenced when his mouth covered hers. She blinked twice before allowing her expression to transition from terrified to confused. He wasn't ravaging her. Instead, it was a chaste kiss. A simple meeting and touching of the lips that, honestly, had her blushing like a schoolgirl. He pulled away, the hum reverberating from his throat filled the air between them. Ichigo. She whispered his name experimentally. However, he ignored her for the most part. His eyes, bleeding a darker red by the second, seemed entirely focused on her small mouth. His hand came up and she felt his thumb reach out and trace the lines of her mouth. You have very kissable lips, wife of mine. She froze momentarily and then her entire face flamed in warmth. She silently cursed him in the corners of her mind. It was always when she least expected it that he would decide to romance her. And, admittedly, it worked like a charm each and every single time. His face inches from her, slowly he came down once more and Yusaka closed her eyes as she pushed herself up to meet him. As soon as their lips touched, she moved her mouth in a slow fever. She allowed the small spark of desire to build up and flame between them. She wouldn't lie, she loved kissing him. He was the one who taught her how to, after all. In her 400 years of life, she had only ever kissed 2 men. The first was Kunu's biological father. The need to procure an heir had led her to taking a temporary consort. That particular coupling had been assured and meaningless in its entirety. Because of the way she had been raised, she had no idea on how to be with a man. So, in order not to make a fool of herself, she had taken a light aphrodisiac to ensure a night not of utter disappointment. Unfortunately, that was what it had exactly been. Kunu had been conceived in a loveless affair, and her father had decided that he'd rather not be involved in the matters of Kyoto's court. 10 years later, she met Ichigo and, due some unsavory machinations of third parties, found herself spending a lot of time with him. Ichigo had taught her everything sex-orientated that she currently knew. It had been humiliating to have a man centuries younger than her take the lead in such a mortifying manner, though there had hardly been any other option at the time. Even worse had been the first night they had spent together. She had been awkwardly clumsy in her uneased attempts to pleasure him, although he had been gracious enough to not bring up her lack of experience. Still, it did not change the fact that on their first night, he had managed to bring her to a climax 4 times and put her to sleep without having any release himself. She had dedicated the next few nights after that to learning all she could from his body. That was the one thing that had gone in her favor during their marriage, the fact she was a kitsune assisted a great deal in the bedroom. Female kitsune were natural seductresses, ergo she had taken to their bedroom games with all the natural disposition her species possessed. Isaka let out a sudden cry as she felt a sharp pain on her shoulder. "Where are you?" There was a growl in his words as he nuzzled the side of her neck. "I'm right here and you're off somewhere else." The soft moan escaping her turned into a small smile. He was just as possessive of her as she was of him. At times, even more so. She slid his hands over his arms and settled them of his back. The sensation of his rippling muscles under her fingers as he moved over her made cling to him. She pressed him down harder as his teeth nipped at the skin of her neck. He lifted her off the bed and sat both of them up. Snuggling into him and she began to attack him with her own series of furious kisses and love bites. As his hands moved over her body and settled on her hips, she elicited a hiss of pain from him by biting down on his collarbone. She bit it, licked it, kissed it and did everything she could do to it with her mouth. She growled in frustration as every scratch she left on him was quickly healed due to his monstrous regeneration. There was some primal urge in her psyche to mark him physically as hers. She felt his hands caress their way up her back and settled on the edge of the bedsheets that were still tightly woven around her. With one fluid motion, he tore the cloth as if were wet paper. She let out a cold gasp as the cool air suddenly assaulted her exposed breasts, but she had little to worry as Ichigo gripped her ass and pushed her up so that her chest was before his face. He wrapped one arm firmly around her waist and set the other to roughly fondle her chest. She let out a pleasurable groan as he took one of her peaks in his mouth and began to bite down and suck. He was rough and she liked it. Isaka bunched her fingers in his hair as he slid his hand away from her breast and settled it between her legs. She could feel the warm wetness leaking from her core slowly trickle down her thighs as his fingers pushed past her fold. His thumb pressed on her sensitive place and she threw her head back, letting out an bestial snarl. His fingers moved strongly inside her, scratching that spot within her walls that sent waves of electricity crashing through her. She crushed his head to her body and rocked her hips, trying to force his fingers deeper into her. Ichigo. She could feel her hair smack against her back as her movements became more and more frenetic. "Ichigo, I need SHH," he kissed her jawline, "just let me." Her spine arched as pleasure exploded through her. Wanting to cry out in desire, Yusaka instead grabbed Ichigo by the face and kissed him viciously. A moment later, as her climax reached its peak, he laid her down back on the bed, looming over her menacingly as she caught her breath. However, Yusaka wasn't feeling too patient and she reached out with a clawed hand and tore his jeans down their side. "Now," she commanded, her voice warped with a gravely desire. She spread her legs and not a second later, roared in delight as her husband buried himself in a single brutish thrust. Ichigo placed one hand on her lower back and slid it to her ass, lifting her hips off the bed and sending himself deeper into her. Yusaka managed a breathless gasp before he crushed his lips to hers. "I love you." She managed to moan out between rough kisses. "I love you too." The moment he stepped out of the portal and into his office, a flare of annoyance crossed his eyes as he beheld 2 individuals. He directed his sight to the taller of the 2, a willowy and plainly dressed devil of seemingly middle age and strict countenance. "Who are you and what do you want?" Ichigo didn't bother with any semblance of politeness. Above all else, devils respected power and position. As it was, there were only 5 amongst the nobility who held a higher position than he did and, as for power, well, that was highly debatable. Willowy man stepped forward and bowed low at the waist. "To His Deplorable Highness, the Crown Prince and Lord Wrath, I bring honored greetings from my master, oh, for the love of Lucifer." Ichigo rolled his eyes and cut the man off. Crossing his arms and leaning a hip against the side of his desk, he glared at the taken-aback devil. "If you don't get to the point, my servants will be scrapping your charred carcass off my floor." Willowy man made a high-pitched choking noise. "Lord Furkaz would like to purchase mining rights in the Ash Mountains," he blurted out in one go. Ichigo continued to glare at the devil for several moments, all the while the poor messenger had sweat pouring down his brow. Ichigo let out a grunt and the willowy man flinched on the spot. "No, now get out. My apologies for the disturbance, my prince." He quickly scurried out of the room, though Ichigo called after him as he did. "Tell Furkaz that if he wants something, come negotiate it in person." The only acknowledgement his words received was the sounds of the heavy doors shutting with a resolute thud. Ichigo shook his head. "Spineless leech. That was highly unprofessional of you, Ichigo." His eyes flitted over the other intruder in his personal office. "Hardly," he snorted. "I'm the sin of wrath, remember? Having a short temper is what I do. Ichigo, I don't know how many times I have to apologize, but please, again, wrath. Not stupidity." He stared hard at the person before his features softened considerably. And I never blamed you, Graffian. It's not like you had anything to do with it to begin with. Besides, even if you did have something to do with, it's been well over a year since then. I'd have forgiven you by now. Holding on to a grudge for that long without actually doing something about it is not my style. I'm glad to hear that. The Silver Queen stepped forward and into the light dancing from through the glass balcony doors behind him. However, I'm going to assume you've also completely forgiven Surzich's. This based off the fact you did something about it and enacted your vengeance. Well, yeah. He shrugged helplessly. He made me a partial embodiment of evil without my consent and I crushed his left testicle. I think that even outs things. Well, not for him I mean. Graffia gave him a dry glare. Yes, well, thank you for only crushing one of them. Had you destroyed both, it would have taken twice as long for him to recuperate and twice as long as for me to have my husband back in my bed. Not wanting to go down that particular line of thought, he quickly changed the subject. Motioning with one hand, he gestured towards her clothing. What's with the getup? Jeans and a t-shirt. Soccer mom, much. He rarely ever saw Graffia out of her customary maid garb and, when he did, it was always in a long skirt and blouse. Or something more professional and conservative at least. He had never seen her wear something so casual. As a matter of fact, yes. I just returned from a trip to the park with Milikas. Oh, impressive. Ichigo nodded his head sagely. Wait a minute, does Milikas even know what a park is? Graffia looked at him crossly. My son knows what a park is, Ichigo. He's a perfectly normal 11-year-old devil, I'll have you know. He's just a little sheltered. If you say so. I do. He gave small laugh. So, what's the occasion? You tend to spend your days off at the manor with him. Her silver eyes became a magnitude heavier. She sighed and walked over to where he stood and leaned against his desk alongside him. I wanted to take him out of the manor to escape the current atmosphere. Honestly, things are, putting it lightly, not good. He cast her a sideways glance. Oh. Do tell. There's a banquet tonight to finalize Ria's engagement. The entire Grimoire territory is in a rather melancholic temper at the moment. That's right, he said tapping his chin. That was last night, wasn't it? The rating game between her and Riser Phoenix. I'm gonna go off on a limb and say she lost. She actually did rather well. A small smile touched with a hint of pride crossed her lips. In fact, not one of us even dreamed she would get so far. She managed to eliminate Riser's entire peerage. Only finally admitting defeat when he captured her pawn and started to torture him before her very eyes. He let out an appreciative whistle. I've seen his peerage in the lower tier rating games before. They're not bad. For Ria's to actually do terminate all of them, wow. Color me impressed. But, correct me if I'm wrong, wasn't the engagement supposed to be finalized in a couple more years? Why speed it up? Graffia took a moment as if she were carefully considering what words to choose. Outside meddling. It went without saying, Ichigo felt little desire to play with subtlety. Old Zekrom, eh? Graffia gave a nod. Which brings me to the reason why I'm here. His brow furrowed. I almost forgot about that. What are you doing here? Not that you're unwelcome or anything, but whatever happened to that unwritten rule about sins and their servants not walking into each other's territories without an invitation? She raised a questioning eyebrow at him. Are you saying I'm a bother? Never. Feel free to drop by whenever. But you've always been a stickler for formality, that's all I'm saying. That was when you were my charge, she said coolly. You are now my superior. Far be it from me to correct you on your behavior. He gave her an incredulous stare. You smack around Surzich's like he's your personal punching bag and he's your immediate superior. The dust of impishness ran through her silver eyes. Surzich's is my punching bag. A few years more into your own marriage and you'll understand as well. Ichigo chuckled and swept his bangs out of his eyes. How could I forget? Anyways, we've veered off topic. What does the engagement party have to do with me? She held out her hand and, in a puff of purple smoke, a black envelope lettered in glittering red appeared. Obviously you're invited, she said, holding it out to him. He stared at the invite for several moments. Any and all traces of good humor having left his face. Well, the general populace may believe you to be merely Surzich's wife who arbitrarily acts as his assistant, I know that to be far from the actual truth. Graffia Lucifuge does not go around personally delivering party invitations on the fly. He narrowed his eyes and took himself off his desk. Glaring down at the strongest queen in the underworld, he raised a challenging eyebrow. What is this about? She met him with a look of frigid neutrality and held up the black envelope. Ducal House Grimoire and the office of His Highness Lucifer would greatly appreciate it if His Highness, the Lord Wrath, would make an appearance at tonight's festive event to commemorate the engagement of Lady Ria's Grimoire to Lord Riser Phoenix. Never breaking eye contact with her, Ichigo reached out and accepted the envelope. You can tell them I'll be there. Graffia smiled and patted his cheek patronizingly, causing him to roll his eyes. That's my boy. Have a nice evening, Ichigo. She came off his desk and, as she walked away, Ichigo called out to her. "Here, let me send you out." A twist of his fingers and a portal to Gremory Manor appeared. For obvious security reasons, within the floor his office was located, he was the only one allowed to teleport in and out. She sent him an appreciative smile and, as she prepared to step into the dimensional path, she turned and regarded him with a look. "I don't think I need to tell you, but." He nodded his head at her words. "I'll be gone." Graphia gave a wave as she left. "Do take care of yourself, Ichigo, and have a wonderful vacation." The gaping maw closed, swallowing Graphia and leaving him alone. Surzich's machinations are as amusing as ever. Almost alone. Ichigo tuned towards the doors of the balcony and, out of the moonlight sifting through, Tiamat shimmered into being. The enigmatic smile ever present on her lips. As she stayed her ground and kept the desk between them, Ichigo fought the urge to grin. In a typical fashion, Tiamat had the tendency to throw herself at him whenever he returned from leaving her presence and smother him with physical displays of affection. However, fun fact about dragons, their sense of smell put even wolves to shame. Therefore, seeing as even he could smell Yasaka's jasmine fragrance wafting off his body and clothes, Tiamat wouldn't approach, much less touch him, until he showered. As luck would have it, the opposite would also hold true. Yasaka loathed it when he came to Kyoto smelling of sea and salt. She would often throw him into the baths when he would visit from the underworld, fresh off of an unnecessarily lengthy hug from Tiamat. Though that was hardly the end of it. At the beginning of their three-way relationship, Ichigo was immensely vexed as to why both the women in his life often forced him to bathe so frequently. He had, at one point, even begun to grow self-conscious of developing foul body odor. Not a far-fetched theory when he considered the fact he would frequently delve into the depths of hell for various reasons. As luck would have it, no one liked the scent of smoldering brimstone. However, he soon discovered that both Yasaka and Tiamat would purposely scent his clothes just before he would leave their respective worlds to annoy the other waiting woman. Naturally, every time this would happen, he would be stripped naked, shoved in the bath and have his clothes disposed of. It had gotten to the point where he had to replace a whole wardrobe before he finally managed to figure out why so many of his clothes were disappearing. When he did discover the fact, he dragged Tiamat and Yasaka together and had them practically begging for his forgiveness by the end of the dressing down he gave them. He wasn't the sin of wrath for nothing, after all. Entertaining and predictable. I saw this one coming over a year ago. Thankfully Graphia is on my side for this. That parchment, she gestured towards the black envelope with her eyes, is but an ill-veiled summons. Your presence is being demanded rather than requested. Ichigo twirled the envelope in his fingers. As he did, he caught sight of the lettering address written clear in a crisp cursive script. He read over the words with a nonchalance before flipping the envelope again. Suddenly, the entire thing burst into flames. I don't think Surzich's expects me to play along. If anything, he's probably wondering how I'm going to get at him for this. The Dragon King shook her head. Devils. Ever do you play your games? What can I say, he shrugged. It's fun, it keeps me busy, and it's Surzich's move. Well, he pulled out his phone, it will be right after this. Tiamat settled herself down onto his chair and began to play with a small wooden shield with a black crossbones and skull etched onto it. And what will we be doing while you wait for him to respond to your provocation? While he didn't glance away from his phone, he did smirk at the obvious heavy emphasis she placed on we. We will be vacationing in the human world for the next few weeks. As soon as I take a shower and pack our things, we leave. The human world. He could hear the frown in her voice. What is there to be done there? For me? Tying up a few loose ends. Surzich's frowned heavily as he looked about, unable to find his former pawn. Where in hell was he? The disconcerting and ironic possibility of the young devil actually escaping to the inferno gave him pause. If Ichigo really was in hell, then there would be little to no chance of him appearing here. He'd often disappear to days on end when he went into the pits. I thought you said he agreed to attend, he whispered from the side of his mouth. He obviously lied. Was his wife's unimpressive response. If it weren't for all the people in attendance, he would have openly glared at how nonchalant she was being at all of this. He centered his attention to the other side of the room. Standing with her queen, Riaz was politely accepting everyone's congratulatory words with a forced smile. All the while, his younger sister's eyes were void of any emotion, save for the slight semblance of barely traceable despair. Ah. Where the hell is Ichigo? Riatan is suffering so horribly, and that heartless wretch is nowhere in sight. Damn it, he muttered angrily. We don't have any more time. We're going with plan B, go get the dragon brat. Not possible, she immediately responded. What? His outburst garnered him several curious stares from the partygoers. Sending everyone quick and appeasing smiles, he hissed through gritted teeth. Why not? He woke up earlier than we planned. In his disappointment and self-abusing shame, he set about cleaning out the refrigerator, including a carton of milk that was long since perished. I'm afraid the only field of battle he'll be traversing is a toilet. Surzich's felt his jaw unhinge. You're shitting me. No, but the Sasukeuchiha is. Of all the time for his wife to grow a sense of humor. Unexpectedly, a voice cried out the words he was so desperately wishing to say himself. I object to this engagement. Aha. Finally, you wait a minute, that's not Ichigo's voice. Plainly fuddled, Surzich's followed everyone's gaze towards the lone person who shouted out. As his eyes landed on a diminutive form of red hair, his throat went dry. Fuck. Screw you, Ichigo. It was Graphia who gave voice to their shared horror. Milikas. The clouds were always on a dull edge whenever they came here. Not that she minded, really. In fact, she appreciated the fact that the sun wasn't shining down and baking the earth into its usual clay-like dryness. It was rather thoughtful of the sun, truthfully. Admittedly, the growing dark in the clouds made her realize that the sky was not too far from opening up and unleashing a deluge down onto their heads. Again, it was another blessing. It meant that they would not be able to linger here for long. This was a place of regret and unwanted memories for her, as it was. Coming here, paying due respects and then being on their way was what had felt right to her since she had been a child. She cast a glance over her shoulder, noting her sister and father following at a distance. Keeping her eyes on them for a bare moment, she returned her attention to the gravelly grey stone path in front of her, the one that ran a stark contrast to the bright and lively grass around the squares of lifeless stone. She continued forwards, knowing her destination was at the bricked wall rising in her line of sight. However, as she came closer, something gave her pause. There were two people exactly where only her family should be. Yet, standing there they were, nonetheless. Oddly enough, it wasn't the where that concerned her so much, but rather, the who. Chiefly, the man on the left with unruly hair of a dull orange. The breath in her lungs froze to ice as he turned around with a lazy grace. A wisp of smoke coiling around his face from the smoldering and lit cigarette in his mouth. His eyes were expecting and, rather insultingly, dull. He gave her an unenthusiastic wave. Yo, Karen. You've gotten taller. Let me know in the comments below if you guys want the next part. Also check out my other video that has been shown and left. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed this video please like and share this video. And have a fantastic day. Bye.